He kissed her right there in the hallway, not hidden, not careful, not even ashamed. Naomi Bennett had traveled 40 minutes across the city, carrying a hand-wrapped anniversary gift, her heart full of something she hadn't felt in months' hope, and she walked straight into a half-open hotel door and watched her husband press his mouth against another woman's lips, like Naomi had never existed. Like 3 years of marriage was something he could fold up and put in his pocket, like she was nothing. The gift hit the marble floor before she even realized she'd dropped it. And Kang Jae-min, the most feared man on the East Coast, a man who made grown criminals flinch when he walked into a room, turned and looked directly at his wife. He didn't move. He didn't explain. He just looked at her. And in that moment, Naomi understood something that 3 years of marriage, countless warning signs, and a quick night spent waiting for a man who never fully arrived, had failed to teach her. She had never really known her husband at all. If you've ever stood in a moment so painful that your body simply stops, no tears, no screaming, just this terrible silence where your whole life rearranges itself, then you already know what Naomi felt standing in that corridor. What would you have done? Stay with us through this story. If it moves you, and I believe it will, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. We tell stories that don't let go. And while you're watching, drop a comment below and tell me the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because what happened next changed everything. The morning of their 3rd anniversary, Naomi woke up alone. That part wasn't unusual. Jaemin's side of the bed had been cold before sunrise more times than she could count. She had learned, sometime in the 2nd year of their marriage, to stop reaching for him in the dark. The empty space was just there. The way the security cameras outside their bedroom window were just there. The way the 2 men stationed at the front gate were just there, permanent, unasked for, and impossible to pretend away. She lay still for a moment, listening to the house breathe around her. The Bennett Kang estate sat on 3 acres outside the city, gated and quiet and beautiful in a way that sometimes felt less like home and more like a very expensive cage. The rooms were large. The ceilings were high. The staff moved softly and spoke rarely, trained to make themselves invisible, and sometimes Naomi felt invisible alongside them. She sat up, pushed her hair back, and decided today was going to be different. She had been planning this for 3 weeks. A private getaway, just the 2 of them, no security detail, no business calls, no men in dark suits appearing at restaurant tables to whisper things in Jaemin's ear that made him go quiet for the rest of the evening. She had booked a small coastal inn 2 hours north of the city. She had arranged coverage with Jaemin's assistant, carefully, diplomatically, in the way you learn to handle things when your husband runs both a legitimate real estate empire and something you don't name out loud in polite company. She had even bought him a gift. It wasn't expensive, not by the standards of what Jaemin could afford. It was a custom compass, the kind you have engraved. On the back, she had put 4 words, "Find your way home." She'd had it wrapped in dark paper and tied with a clean white ribbon, and she'd packed it in her overnight bag, along with 2 changes of clothes and the renewed, fragile belief that marriages didn't have to bleed out slowly if 2 people were willing to try. She showered, dressed, and texted him, leaving at 6. "Please don't be late." He responded 20 minutes later. "I'll be there," 3 words. She told herself it was enough. It wasn't until 5:30, standing at the airport departure terminal with her bag at her feet and the compass gift in her hands, that the first knot tightened in her stomach. 6 o'clock came and went. She called his cell. It rang 4 times and kicked to voicemail, that measured impersonal recording that always struck her as funny in a painful way, because Jaemin's voice on the phone sounded exactly like his voice in person, composed, certain, giving away nothing. She left a message. She didn't make it sound worried. She had too much pride for that. 7 o'clock. She tried his assistant, a quiet, efficient woman named Park, who had worked for Jaemin for 6 years and had perfected the art of saying nothing while sounding completely cooperative. Park told her, very gently, that Mr. Kang had been pulled into an urgent meeting late that afternoon and had likely lost track of time. Likely, that word did its quiet damage. Naomi sat in a molded airport chair for another 40 minutes. She watched families move past her with rolling luggage and children balanced on hips. She watched older couples, the kind who walked side by side without talking because they'd already said everything and were comfortable in the silence. She watched them and felt something shift in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't quite grief. It was closer to the feeling of recognizing something you've been looking at for a very long time without actually seeing it. She called the tracking app connected to the family vehicles. Jae-min didn't know she had the password, or maybe he did know and simply didn't think she would ever use it. The signal for the black SUV he'd taken that morning placed him at the Alara Grand Hotel in Midtown. She sat with that information for exactly 4 minutes. Then she picked up her bag, walked to the taxi stand outside, and told the driver the hotel address. She didn't let herself think too clearly on the ride over. There were explanations. There were always explanations in Jae-min's world meetings that moved locations, associates who required face-to-face conversation in neutral venues, the constant grinding machinery of his business that demanded more than it ever gave back. She told herself this. She almost believed it. The Alara Grand's lobby was all white marble and controlled lighting, the kind of hotel that made you lower your voice without being asked. She took the elevator to the penthouse floor. The compass gift was still in her hands. She had not put it down. The corridor on the top floor was long and quietly carpeted. Most of the doors were closed. But at the far end, one door sat open, not fully, just enough for light to spill out in a thin vertical stripe. Naomi walked toward it without deciding to, and she stopped. Through that gap, through that careless, unguarded, half-open door, she saw her husband. Yuna Siso was a woman Naomi had heard about before the wedding. Not in specific terms, Jae-min didn't traffic in specific terms when it came to his personal life, but in the way you hear about someone in the spaces between what people actually say. A former relationship, someone from before, someone who had stayed in his professional orbit because she was useful, talented, and trusted inside his organization. Naomi had seen her twice at formal events. She was striking in the way that made other women take inventory of themselves without meaning to. She had a certain ease around Jae-min, the ease of history, of someone who had already passed through all the difficult introductions and knew exactly how much space to occupy. Now her arms were around Naomi's husband's neck, and Jae-min was kissing her back. It lasted 4 seconds, maybe 5, maybe 100 years. Naomi would never be fully certain because time does a strange thing in moments like that. It compresses and expands simultaneously, and the details burn themselves into your memory with a clarity you will never manage to forget, no matter how hard you try. The compass slipped from her hands. The sound it made when it struck the marble threshold, a clean, sharp crack, was not loud. But in the silence of that corridor, it was a gunshot. Jae-min turned. His eyes found Naomi in approximately half a second. He was good at reading rooms, good at threat assessment, good at the kind of rapid situational calculation that had kept him alive and powerful for 15 years in a world that ate men like him for breakfast. But for the first time in their marriage, Naomi watched that calculation fail him completely. Something crossed his face that she had never seen there before, something unguarded and raw that might have been panic if Jae-min had been the kind of man who panicked. Yuna took a slow step backward. She did not look particularly guilty. She looked, Naomi thought, almost satisfied. Nobody spoke. The silence lasted long enough to become its own kind of cruelty. Naomi looked at her husband's face. She looked at the woman still standing close enough to touch him. She looked at the compass, on the floor the engraved back face-up, though she was too far away to read the words, and she felt the very last piece of the version of herself that had believed in this marriage quietly leave her body. She reached down. She picked up the compass. She set it on the nearest flat surface, a narrow table against the corridor wall, meant for flower arrangements. Then she removed her wedding ring. It was a simple platinum band, nothing ostentatious, chosen specifically because Naomi had asked for something she could wear while working. She placed it beside the compass with the same steadiness she would have placed a paintbrush. She looked at Jae-min one more time. "You finally made my decision easy." She turned around and walked to the elevator. She did not run. She did not look back. The elevator doors opened immediately, as if the building itself was cooperating, and she stepped inside, and watched the doors close and stared at her own reflection in the mirrored interior, her face entirely dry, her hands entirely steady, her expression that of someone who has just received news they already knew was coming and have simply been waiting to hear confirmed. She took a taxi home. She walked through the front door of the estate for what she understood, with absolute clarity, would be the last time. She moved through the house with the focused, unhurried efficiency of someone who had already made their decision and was simply executing it. She packed what was hers, not the jewelry, not the designer wardrobe, not any of the beautiful, expensive things that had been purchased with money that came from a world she had never fully agreed to inhabit. Her design drafts, her personal sketchbooks, the small framed photograph from her mother's kitchen, her laptop, her own clothes, bought before the marriage, before the estate, before all of it. She sat at the desk in the room she had claimed as a studio and wrote out the divorce papers she's had, somewhere in a sealed part of herself, already prepared 3 months ago. She signed them. She left them on the nightstand on Jaemin's side of the bed. She did not write a note. She had already said everything she needed to say in that corridor, and she had said it in 8 words, and it was enough. She left before midnight. By the time Jaemin returned to the estate 36 hours later, though it would be a full 7 days before he actually asked anyone where his wife was, Naomi Bennett was already somewhere else entirely. Her phone had been disconnected. Her accounts were closed and zeroed out. She left no forwarding address. She simply disappeared, the way people only disappear when they have been planning it quietly for much longer than anyone realized. What Jaemin told himself in the first 48 hours was a story he was practiced at telling. She needs space. He had been a difficult man to love, he knew this, had always known it, in the abstract way that self-aware people know their worst qualities without necessarily being moved to change them. Naomi had stayed through hard things before. She was not fragile. She was, in fact, one of the least fragile people he had ever known, which was part of why he had been drawn to her in the first place. She had a kind of stillness about her that he found not calming, exactly, but grounding the way certain rooms ground you when you walk into them. He told himself she would come back when she was ready to talk. He genuinely believed this. He had, over 3 years of marriage, grown so accustomed to the idea of Naomi staying that he had completely failed to account for the possibility that she might one day decide leaving was a better option. This was, he would eventually understand, the most expensive mistake of his life. And Jaemin Kang had made mistakes that cost people considerably more than money. In the meantime, his organization was in the middle of something that required his full attention, a territorial dispute that had been simmering for 8 months, and had recently come to a head in a way that demanded he be physically present, strategically alert, and diplomatically lethal in equal measure. He managed it the way he managed most threats, methodically, without emotion, with the cold precision that had made him what he was. He went 3 days without thinking about his wife. Not because he didn't care, but because compartmentalization was a survival skill he had honed over 15 years. And the compartment marked Naomi, the one he had always trusted to stay sealed when he needed it to. On the 4th day, he tried to call her. The number was disconnected. He stood in his office on the 19th floor of the Kang Holdings building and listened to the automated message twice. Then, he put the phone down carefully, the way you put something down when your hands are less steady than you want them to be. He called Park. Park had not heard from Mrs. Kang. He called the house. Mrs. Gale, the housekeeper, told him Mrs. Kang had taken several bags and left the night of the anniversary. She had assumed Mr. Kang knew. He pulled up the joint accounts. Empty, not spent, transferred. The money moved to a charitable account Naomi had set up years ago for a design scholarship fund. Every cent returned to a cause rather than kept for herself. He checked the credit cards linked to his accounts. None of them had been used since the night of the hotel. She wasn't hiding. She was gone. He sent 2 men to check her sister's apartment in Philadelphia. Her sister, a teacher named Diane, who had never fully warmed to Jaemin, despite 3 years of polite holiday dinners, told them through a door she did not open more than 4 inches that she had not seen Naomi, and that if Mr. Kang was looking for his wife, he might consider reflecting on why she left before asking where she went. His men reported this back to him verbatim, because they had been trained to report everything verbatim and because none of them were willing to edit that particular message before delivery. Jae-min dismissed them and sat alone in his office for 22 minutes. Then he activated the full network. It took 11 days. 11 days for the most sophisticated private intelligence network on the East Coast to locate one woman with no phone, no credit cards, and no digital footprint who was, as it turned out, living openly in a town called Bellwether under her own name. She wasn't hiding. That was the detail that undid him. She simply didn't care enough about his reach to hide from it. Bellwether was the kind of town that looked like it had been painted by someone who'd never left the county. A river ran through the east side. The main street had 3 restaurants and a hardware store that had apparently been operated by the same family for 40 years. The town was known for its ceramics, a traditional style specific to the region, something about the clay composition in the surrounding hills, making it particularly suited to a certain kind of high-fire work that local artists had been doing for generations. His man, a quiet, efficient operative named Cho, sent him photographs. The first one showed a small pottery courtyard attached to a workshop behind what appeared to be a converted farmhouse. The second showed an elderly man in a canvas apron, working at a wheel. The third showed Naomi. Jae-min looked at that photograph for a long time. She was wearing clothes he didn't recognize: worn jeans, a loose linen shirt with a smear of gray clay along one sleeve. Her hair was pulled back without particular care. She was standing beside the old man, and both of them were looking at something out of the frame, and she was laughing, not performing, not the careful, polished smile she wore at his business dinners, laughing with her whole face, the way she used to in the first months of their marriage before the weight of what his life actually was settled down on both of them like a second ceiling. She looked like a different person. She looked, and this was the part that hit him somewhere below the sternum, happier than she had looked in 2 years. Cho's report indicated she had been taken in by a local artist named Silas Monroe, 73. No criminal record, no connection to any known parties, a retired professor of ceramic arts who ran an informal apprenticeship program for 3 or 4 students at a time out of his converted farmhouse studio. Naomi had apparently arrived with her design portfolio and asked if he needed someone who understood structure and proportion and was willing to learn the rest. Monroe had said yes. She had been sleeping in a small room at the back of the main house and working 12-hour days in the studio. She was not in hiding. She was rebuilding. Jae-min closed the file, opened it again, and then gave the instruction that surprised every member of his team so thoroughly that Cho actually asked him to repeat it. Nobody moves. Nobody contacts her. Nobody goes near the town. I'll go myself. 300 miles away, in a pottery courtyard in Bellwether, Naomi pressed her palms into wet clay and felt, for the first time in 3 years, like she was touching something real. She didn't know he was already on his way. And even if she had, she would not have run. Running would have suggested she was afraid. And Naomi Bennett had stopped being afraid of Kang Jae-min the moment she put her wedding ring down on a hallway table in the El Era Grand Hotel and walked toward an elevator door with her spine perfectly straight and her hands perfectly steady and the absolute cellular certainty that she was done. Not angry, not broken, done. He arrived on a Tuesday. She saw him from across the courtyard, and her first thought, which she would later find both revealing and irritating, was that he looked tired. Not physically. Jae-min kept himself well, in the way that men who view physical capability as a professional requirement tend to do. But there was something around his eyes that hadn't been there before. A weight that his particular brand of composed authority couldn't quite cover. He stood at the entrance to the courtyard and did not call her name. He simply stood there, the way he always entered rooms, as though arrival itself was sufficient announcement. Silas noticed him before Naomi did. The old man looked up from his wheel, looked at Jae-min, looked at Naomi, and had the particular wisdom to say nothing. He simply set down his tools, stood slowly with the deliberateness of a man whose knees had opinions about standing, and walked into the main house. He left the courtyard door open behind him. Naomi set her work down carefully. She wiped her hands on the cloth, draped over the wheel stand. She looked at her husband, at the man who had been her husband, with an expression that she had not rehearsed and did not perform. There was no anger in it, no heat at all. Just a kind of quiet, settled assessment The way you look at something from a distance after you've been up close to it for a very long time and have only recently gained enough perspective to see what it actually was. That look, more than anything else, is what undid Jae-min Kang. He could have withstood rage. He had been raged at by men who wanted him dead. He could have withstood tears. He had watched people weep at his feet for mercy and had granted it or not granted it, based on strategic considerations, unmoved. He could have withstood accusations, demands, recriminations. What he could not withstand, what he had never prepared for and had no defense against, was indifference. Not the cold, performed indifference of someone pretending not to care. The real kind. The kind that comes after caring so much for so long that the caring finally simply exhausted itself, and what's left behind isn't pain or anger or longing. Just a clear-eyed recognition of what is unclouded by what you wished it had been. He crossed the courtyard. He stopped 6 feet away from her. Naomi, Jae-min. Her voice was level, not cold. Just level. He looked around the courtyard for a moment, taking it in, processing it, running whatever calculation he ran, when he needed to understand the terrain of a situation. Then he looked back at her. I need you to hear what happened. At the hotel. No, she said simply, without heat. You don't. It wasn't, I know what I saw. You saw 30 seconds. I saw enough. She pulled the cloth from the wheel and folded it with the automatic neatness of someone who does physical work and has learned to care for the tools of it. I'm not interested in the explanation, Jae-min. I'm not angry enough to need one. That last sentence landed on him like something physical. Not angry enough to need one. He stood in a pottery courtyard, in a town he had never heard of 2 months ago, in front of the woman he had married, and understood for the first time that the opposite of love was not hate. Hate required engagement. Hate required you to still care about the other person's response. What Naomi was giving him was something quieter and considerably more final. And somewhere in the educated, calculating mind of Kang Jae-min, a door clicked shut that he had not known he was still hoping might remain open. Tell me what you want, he said finally. Whatever it is. She looked at him with that same clear, even gaze. I want to finish what I'm working on before the clay dries. She turned back to the wheel. He stood there for another moment. Then he sat down, unbidden, on the low stone bench against the courtyard wall, and watched her work. She did not tell him to leave, but she did not look at him again. And in the silence of that courtyard, with sunlight moving slowly across the clay and the sound of the river carrying faintly from a few blocks east, Jae-min Kang began to understand the specific and irreversible shape of what he had lost. He stayed on that bench for 2 hours. Naomi didn't acknowledge him again. She worked the clay with the focused, almost meditative attention of someone who had learned that physical objects required honesty they cracked. If you pushed wrong, collapsed if you rushed, and no amount of wanting them to be different changed what they actually were. She centered a new piece, drew the walls up slowly, shaped the rim with her thumbs. Her hands moved with a confidence that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. When Silas first stood behind her and said, with the bluntness of someone who had no patience left for softening things, "You're fighting it. Stop fighting it and just feel where it wants to go." She had thought about that for days afterward. It applied to more than clay. Jae-min sat with his forearms on his knees and watched her work and said nothing else. He was not. She noted from her peripheral vision, performing patience. He was actually sitting still in the way that men who have spent years in rooms where patience was a tactical weapon, sometimes do economical, unhurried, waiting without visibly waiting. Under different circumstances, she might have respected it. When Silas came back out at 4 o'clock with 2 mugs of coffee and set them both on the bench without comment, Jae-min accepted the mug with a quiet thank you that Naomi could tell surprised the old man slightly. Silas glanced at her. She kept her eyes on her work. He went back inside. At 4:40, Naomi covered the piece she was working on with a damp cloth, stood, stretched the back of her neck with one hand, and looked at Jae-min directly, for the first time since he'd sat down. "There's a diner 2 blocks east," she said. "If you need to eat before you drive back." "I'm not driving back tonight." "That's your business." "I booked a room at the inn on the river road." "Good for you." She picked up the 2 empty mugs and walked inside. He sat on the bench for another moment, looking at the covered piece on the wheel, and then he stood and followed her to the doorway, not inside, just to the doorway, and said, "Naomi." "One conversation, that's all I'm asking." She had her back to him at the small sink in the workroom. She rinsed the mugs. You've been asking for the wrong things for 3 years, J-Man. I don't think one more ask is going to fix that pattern. I know what I did, do you? Not a question. I kissed her. I shouldn't have. I'm not going to stand here and tell you it meant nothing, because you're too smart for that, and I respect you too much to try it. He paused. But I need you to know that whatever Yuna told you, or whatever you think the full picture looks like. Naomi turned around. Her hands were still wet. She looked at him with an expression that he had never quite seen on her face before. Not anger, not hurt, but something close to a very tired clarity. Yuna didn't tell me anything, she said. I haven't spoken to Yuna. I saw what I saw. You turned, you looked at me, and you didn't move. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the kiss. The fact that when you saw me standing there, you didn't immediately move away from her. You just stood there and looked at me. She pulled a cloth off the hook above the sink and dried her hands. That look told me everything the 3 years before. It didn't quite manage to. She walked past him toward the inner hallway. Dinner's at 6 if you want to eat with us, she said, without turning around. Silas doesn't mind company, but if you're going to be here tomorrow, I need you to not be here when I'm working. He stood in the doorway and listened to her footsteps move down the hall. He did not go to dinner. He walked back to his car, sat in it for 15 minutes with the engine off, and then drove to the inn on the river road and checked into the room he had booked and lay on top of the bedspread with his shoes still on, staring at the ceiling, running the same 2 minutes of footage in his mind on a loop that he could not seem to stop or fast forward or edit into something more tolerable. When you saw me standing there, you didn't move. He had no answer to that, not one that held up. He ordered room service he didn't eat and made 3 calls to his lieutenant, a compact, quietly dangerous man named Han, who updated him on the state of the territorial situation with the practiced neutrality of someone delivering information to a man who rewards accuracy and punishes guesswork. The situation was, Han told him, essentially resolved. The opposing faction had agreed to terms. There would be a formal meeting the following week to finalize the arrangement. Jamin listened. He asked 2 questions. He ended the call. He stared at the ceiling some more. The room was clean and quiet and smelled faintly of cedar, and through the window he could hear the river, a low, continuous sound that was not quite white noise, but close enough to make the silence feel occupied rather than empty. He found himself thinking about the first time he had brought Naomi to his apartment, 3 months before they married. She had stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city and said, "It's beautiful, and it looks absolutely nothing like where people actually live." And he had laughed. He remembered that clearly, laughing, genuinely, not the performative acknowledgement he gave to things that were meant to be amusing, but actually weren't. She had made him laugh in a way that felt like something loosening. He had not told her what she was agreeing to marry into with enough honesty to constitute informed consent. He knew that. He had told himself she understood. She was not naive. She was not sheltered. She was a grown woman who had eyes and asked questions, and was smart enough to read between lines. But understanding something in the abstract and living inside it daily were different countries, and he had handed her a passport without telling her what the immigration process looked like. 3 years of armed men outside restaurants. 3 years of midnight phone calls and unexplained absences and conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. 3 years of Naomi making herself fit into the spaces his life left open, and him telling himself that was enough because she stayed, because she always stayed, because the fact of her staying was something. He had quietly stopped earning and started simply expecting. He fell asleep with the ceiling light still on and woke at 3 in the morning with the particular sharp alertness of someone whose body has spent years treating the middle of the night as a time to be ready for something. He lay still and listened to the river. He thought about the photograph Cho had sent him, the one where she was laughing. He went back to sleep. In the morning, he went to the diner. Naomi was already there. She was sitting at a corner table with a mug of coffee and a sketchbook open in front of her, drawing something with the focused, quick-handed concentration of someone capturing an idea before it escaped. She was wearing a green sweater he didn't recognize, and her hair was down. She almost never wore it down, and she didn't look up when the bell above the door announced his arrival. He sat across from her without asking permission. She looked up then, Something moved across her face, not irritation, exactly. More like the mild resignation of someone whose day has just become slightly more complicated. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." A waitress appeared. He ordered coffee. Naomi looked back at her sketchbook. "What are you drawing?" he asked. She turned the sketchbook slightly. It was a series of vessel shapes, narrow at the base, widening asymmetrically toward the rim, with notations about wall thickness along the margins. Design notes precise and professional. She was, he realized, working. Even here, even at 7 in the morning over coffee in a diner booth. She had always been like that, incapable of fully separating herself from whatever she was creating. "Silas wants me to develop a series for a small show he's curating in the spring," she said. "Local galleries. Nothing big. But it's something to work toward." "That's good." Yes, silence. His coffee arrived. He wrapped both hands around the mug. "I want to apologize," he said. Naomi closed the sketchbook. She set her pen down on top of it. She looked at him with the same level attention she might give a piece she was trying to determine was salvageable or not. "Okay, I failed you. Not just at the hotel. I failed you consistently for 3 years, in small ways that I convinced myself didn't add up to anything, because you never left." He kept his voice even. He was not performing. This was, she recognized, what Jamin Kang sounded like when he was being truthful, stripped of the authority and the command register, just the plain words. "I treated the fact that you stayed as proof that things were fine. I used your patience like a resource, without putting anything back." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "I know you believe that," she said finally. "It's true. I know it's true, Jamin." She pulled her mug closer. "That doesn't change anything. What would change something?" She looked at him with what might, in a different version of this conversation, have been sadness. "Nothing. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Not because I hate you. Because there isn't anything left to repair. I don't mean that cruelly. I mean it the way you mean it when a thing has run its course." She paused. "I used to lie awake and make lists of all the things I needed you to change. I don't do that anymore. I stopped needing you to be different. That sounds like progress, and it is. But it also means I stopped needing you." The diner was beginning to fill with the morning crowd, local people, people who knew each other, the particular comfortable noise of a small town coming alive. A man in overalls stopped at a table near them and started talking to someone about river levels. 2 teenage girls came in with backpacks and ordered something at the counter. The ordinary world proceeding without any regard for the implosion happening in the corner booth. Jamin said, "I'm not ready to accept that it's over." "You don't have to accept it," Naomi said. "It doesn't require your acceptance. It just is." He looked at her for a long moment. "You signed divorce papers." "Yes, you haven't filed them." She went still. "How do you know that?" "'Cause I would have been served." He held her gaze. "You've had them signed for 3 months. You haven't filed." Something shifted in the air between them. Not warmth, Naomi was too far past warmth for this conversation, but acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that he had noticed what she probably wished he hadn't. "I wanted to be certain I was leaving for the right reasons," she said finally. "Not the right moment." She picked up her pen again. "I'm certain now." He nodded slowly. He didn't push further. He had pushed people further than was wise too many times in his life, and had learned at considerable cost to recognize the walls that didn't move, regardless of force applied. "Can I stay for a few days?" he said. "Not at the house. At the inn. I won't interfere with your work. I just want—" He stopped. She watched him try to find the word and fail. "You want to see me," she said. Yes. It was, she thought, possibly the most honest sentence he had ever spoken to her. Not "I want to explain," or "I want another chance," or "I want you to come home." Just, "I want to see you." The uncomplicated, unstrategic admission of someone who has set down the negotiating position and is just standing there empty-handed. 3 days, she said. Then you go back. He accepted this the way he accepted terms in negotiations, without showing what it cost him. 3 days. She opened her sketchbook again. He drank his coffee. Outside, the Rivertown morning moved around them, indifferent and ordinary and ongoing. The first full day passed without incident. Jamin kept his word. He did not come to the studio. He walked the town, something he was visibly unpracticed at. The wandering without purpose that small towns require of visitors, and he sat by the river for a long time in the afternoon. One of the local shopkeepers, a round-faced woman named May, who ran the hardware store and had appointed herself the town's unofficial information desk, later told Silas that the man in the expensive coat had bought a cup of tea from the cafe for $2 and then sat on a river bench for 2 hours, reading nothing and looking at the water. Friend of Naomi's? May had asked. Something like that, Silas said. He looks like a man waiting for a verdict, May said. Silas had thought about that for a while. At dinner that evening, Silas cooked an efficient, unfussy meal that he put on the table at 6:30, with the reliability of someone who had maintained the same routine for decades. Naomi told him a little about Jae-min. Not the full story, the relevant outline. Silas listened without asking questions, ate his food, and then said, in the way he said most things, without preamble or excessive cushioning, "What do you want him to get from these 3 days?" Naomi thought about it. Nothing. I don't want anything from him. Then what do you want for yourself? She set down her fork. I want him to see that I'm fine. I want him to go back to his life knowing that I'm fine and not spend the next 5 years sending men to check on me or putting security on my apartment because he feels guilty. Silas considered this. Is that the whole truth? She looked at him. I'm 73, he said mildly. I've been married twice and made an extraordinary mess of both. You can tell me the complicated version. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the evening was settling in, the light going amber through the workshop windows. I want him to understand, she said finally quietly, that what I'm building here is real, that I'm not just hiding, that I'm not waiting for him to fix things so I can come back. I want him to look at what I'm doing and understand that this is a life, not a protest, not a waiting room, a life. She picked up her fork again. And I want to want that without needing him to validate it. But apparently I'm not entirely there yet, which is irritating. Silas smiled into his coffee. That's human, not a flaw. It feels like one. Most honest things do. On the second day, Jaemin's phone didn't stop. Naomi saw him in the late morning from the studio doorway. She had stepped out to get more water. He was in the small parking area beside the inn, down the street, pacing a tight circle with his phone against his ear and his free hand moving in the clipped, controlled gestures he used when something required authority to resolve. He was in his other mode, the mode that wasn't husband or even man, in any ordinary sense of the word, just the cold, precise machinery of what he actually was, running at full capacity. She watched him for a moment. She felt nothing romantic about it, but she also felt, and this surprised her slightly, nothing like hatred. He was what he was. He had always been what he was. The failure had not been what he was. The failure was that she had believed for too long that love was supposed to close the distance between who a person actually was and who you needed them to be. She went back inside. At 2 in the afternoon, her own phone, the new one, the number only 3 people had rang. It was Diane. Her sister's voice came through with the characteristic mix of warmth and barely controlled concern that Naomi had grown up navigating. You need to tell me things, Diane said.
Real things.
Not I'm fine, Dee. The pottery is going well. I'm fine. The pottery is going well, Naomi. He's here, silent. In Bellwether? Staying at the inn. Do you need me to come out there? No. Naomi leaned against the workroom wall, turning a small dried clay test piece over in her free hand. He's not dangerous to me. He never was, Dee. I know you never believed that, but it's true. He's just here. Why did you let him stay? 3 days. I gave him 3 days. Why? Naomi thought about it. Because I wanted to close it properly. Not just disappear and leave him with a story he could rewrite in his head. I want him to see that I'm okay, and then I want him to go. Diane was quiet for a moment. You're so much braver than you give yourself credit for. And also sometimes I worry you confuse bravery with not knowing when to protect yourself. I know when to protect myself. Okay. A pause. Call me tonight? Yes. She put the phone down and went back to the wheel. She was midway through a piece. The walls were uneven, in a way she was trying to decide was a mistake or a choice, when the courtyard gate opened, and she heard footsteps she recognized. Not Silas. Too deliberate. Too controlled. She kept her eyes on the clay. I told you not to come when I'm working, she said. I know. Jaemin's voice came from just inside the gate. Something happened. I need to tell you before you hear it from somewhere else. Something in the weight of that sentence made her look up. He was standing at the entrance, still in the coat from yesterday, his phone in his hand. His expression was the one she recognized from the 2 or 3 times she had been present when something genuinely serious landed in his world, not alarmed. Because Jaemin Kang's face did not do alarmed, but calibrated in a way that told you all available resources were being quietly redirected. What? She said. Yuna is here. The clay wheel came to a stop under her hands. In Bellwether? She drove in about an hour ago. My man at the perimeter caught it. He said it without inflection, without apology, for the fact that he had maintained a perimeter, because in his world maintaining a perimeter was as automatic as locking a door. I wanted you to know before she found you. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. Why is she here? Because Yuna has always operated on the belief that the only obstacle between her and what she wants is whatever's in the direct line of sight. He paused. She's known about us, about our problems for longer than you realize. She's been aware that things weren't right for at least a year. How? Because I was not careful enough about what I said around her, and she's very good at assembling information from what people don't say. His jaw tightened slightly. I told you that night at the hotel was a mistake. What I haven't told you, what I owe you the full truth of, is that Yuna has been engineering situations for considerably longer than one night. Dinners, I was told, were operational meetings that included her specifically, after she ensured other attendants canceled. A conference in Chicago where my room and hers ended up on the same floor, due to a booking error she was responsible for. Small things, he held her eyes. I didn't act on them, but I didn't stop them either. And that was its own kind of failure. Naomi sat very still. The clay on her hands was beginning to dry. She could feel it tightening against her skin. You're telling me this now, she said slowly, because she's here, and you want me to have the full picture before she decides to give me her version. Yes, and your version is that she orchestrated it, and you were a passive participant. My version, he said, with the kind of precision she had always found both admirable and maddening, is that she created the opportunities, and I made the choice. Both things are true, and I'm only responsible for one of them. Naomi looked down at her hands. She pressed her thumb into the dried clay at her wrist and felt it crack. Get out of my studio, she said. Naomi, I heard what you said. I'll think about it. Right now I need you to leave. He left. She sat at the wheel for a long time without working. Then she got up, walked to the small basin in the corner, and washed her hands with the careful, thorough attention she gave to washing. Clay off, working it out from under the nails, from the lines of the knuckles, the creases of the palms. When they were clean, she dried them and stood looking at nothing in particular and let herself feel, for exactly 2 minutes, the specific exhaustion of being a woman who has already made her decision and keeps being required to make it again. Then she heard the courtyard gate. The steps were lighter this time, measured differently, and when she turned around, Yuna Seo was standing in the entrance to the pottery courtyard in a cream-colored coat and heeled boots that were completely wrong for a gravel courtyard, looking at Naomi with an expression that was carefully arranged into something resembling concern. I didn't know he was here until this morning, Yuna said. Her voice was smooth and modulated, the voice of a woman who had spent years in rooms where the wrong tone could be costly. I came to talk to you, not to him. Naomi looked at her. I don't have anything to say to you, Yuna. Maybe not, but I have something to say to you. She took 2 steps into the courtyard. Her heels made small decisive sounds against the stone. Whatever he's told you about Chicago and the hotel, he told me enough, is a version that protects him. Yuna continued, as if Naomi hadn't spoken. I want you to have the complete picture, because I think you deserve that. Naomi felt something crystallize in her chest. Not anger, something colder and more useful than anger. You didn't come here for what I deserve, she said. You came here because as long as I exist as Jaemin's wife, I'm between you and what you want. And you've come to deliver the version of events that removes me from that equation most efficiently. She tilted her head slightly. But you've made a miscalculation. A significant one. Yuna's careful expression didn't shift. What miscalculation is that? You think I'm here waiting for a reason to go back to him. You think if you give me enough information, the right information, arranged the right way, I'll feel humiliated enough to either fight for him or walk away on your terms. Naomi stepped closer, not aggressively, just close enough that Yuna would understand the distance was intentional. But I'm not going back, Yuna. Not because of what you tell me. Not because of what he tells me. Because I'm done. That means there is no competition here. There is no obstacle for you to remove. There is no him to win. Yuna looked at her for a long, calculating moment. Then she made the mistake. It was a small physical thing, a slight repositioning of her body, a fractional lift of the chin, the imperceptible realignment of someone who has decided a different tactic is required. She reached into the inner pocket of her coat and produced a folded envelope, which she held out toward Naomi with the practiced grace of someone who has rehearsed this gesture. "Hotel records," she said. "3 separate occasions over the past 18 months. Not the one you saw. 3 others." She let the pause land. "I thought you should know what you were actually forgiving when you decided to walk away." Naomi looked at the envelope. She did not take it. "You thought I was forgiving something," she said. "You walked away. You didn't file. You gave him 3 days." Yuna's voice took on a very slight edge, not enough to be called cruel, but enough to be felt. "That's not someone who's done. That's someone who's still deciding." And there it was. The thing that Naomi had been telling herself wasn't true, which Yuna, who was very good at assembling information from what people didn't say, had found in the gap between what Naomi claimed and what her actions confirmed. She still had not filed the papers. The courtyard was very quiet. Somewhere in the house, a door opened and closed. Silas, probably, aware that something was happening and giving it space to happen without him. The river sound carried in from the east. A car passed on the main road. Naomi looked at the envelope in Yuna's hand. Then she looked up at Yuna's face, and what she said next came out of a place that was not planned, not rehearsed, not the considered response of a woman who had carefully rebuilt herself. For 6 weeks, it came out of the rawest, most animal part of her self-possession, the part that had been holding its breath for 2 days in this courtyard town, managing and containing and maintaining, and had finally had enough of all 3. "You don't have to steal him from me," Naomi said. "I'm giving him back." She reached out gently and folded Yuna's fingers back around the envelope, closed the woman's hand around it. "Step back. Keep the records," she said. "Keep him. Keep the position and the access and whatever else you've spent 18 months maneuvering for. I hope it's everything you calculated it would be." She walked past Yuna through the courtyard gate and around the side of the main house. She did not go inside. She needed air that wasn't inside anything, not the studio, not the house, not the conversation she had just walked out of. She went around the back where the property sloped gently toward a small, overgrown stretch of ground that Silas hadn't gotten around to doing anything with, and she stood in the unstructured grass and breathed and felt the words she had just spoken still vibrating in her chest. "I'm giving him back." The thing she had not expected was how much it hurt. Not because she wanted him back. She did not. The clarity on that point had not changed. But there was a difference between leaving something behind and formally, out loud, in the presence of the woman who wanted it, handing it over, and that difference had a weight she had not fully anticipated. A finality that made the last remaining corner of something she'd been calling decisiveness reveal itself, under pressure, as grief. She stood into the grass behind Silas Monroe's farmhouse in Bellwether and let herself grieve for exactly as long as she needed to. And then she heard Jae-min's voice from around the corner of the building, low, very controlled, the specific register he used when he was furious. And, choosing not to show it saying something she couldn't fully make out, and Yuna's voice responding with the cool efficiency of someone making a case. And she heard the exact moment the conversation turned, because Jaemin's voice dropped another register and said, with absolute and final clarity, "You're done. In this organization, in my life, in any room I walk into. Done, tonight." Silence. Then Yuna's heels on the gravel, moving toward the street. A car door, an engine gone. Naomi stood in the grass. She heard Jaemin's footsteps on the stone path, on the other side of the building. Stop, then not come around the corner. He knew she was back there. He was giving her the choice of whether to come to him or not. She stood still for a long time. Then she walked back around the building and found him standing by the gate with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at nothing, his face carrying the specific exhaustion of a man who has just finished something that needed finishing, but has found no satisfaction in the completion. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I heard what you said to her," he said quietly. "I know, Naomi, don't." Her voice was not unkind, but it was immovable. "What you said to her just now, removing her, that was the right thing. I'm glad you did it." She pulled her sweater tighter against the cooling afternoon air. But removing her doesn't repair me, Jaemin. I need you to understand that. The thing that was broken between us was not Yuna Seo. She was a symptom. She found the cracks that were already there because you left them open long enough. He absorbed this without deflecting it. Then what do I do? He said. Not commanding, not strategizing. Just asking, with the naked simplicity of someone who has run out of other options. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the man she had married and loved and waited for, and quietly, carefully lost faith in over the slow accumulation of 3 years. And she felt the grief in her chest settle into something that was not quite peace, but was at least honest. You go home, she said. You sign the papers. You let me go. He didn't answer immediately. The river sound filled the silence between them. The light was going. The town was doing what small towns do in the early evening, pulling in around itself, quieting, preparing for the ordinary comfort of night. And if I can't, he said. She looked at him steadily. Then you figure out how to, she said. Because I already have. She walked inside. The courtyard gate stood open behind her, and the evening light came through it at a long angle, and Jaemin Kang stood alone in it, for a long time after she was gone, understanding in his body what his mind had been refusing to accept for 3 weeks, that this was not a negotiation he could win, that there were no terms she hadn't already considered and declined, and that the only move left, the only one that wasn't a continuation of everything that had already failed, was the one that cost him the most. He had to let her choose, and she already had. He drove back to the city that same night. He didn't sleep before leaving. He sat in the inn room for approximately 40 minutes, changed out of the coat into something he could drive in, and then walked down to the parking area at 11:15 and pointed the car south and drove the 300 miles back to the city in the dark with the radio off and the windows cracked enough to let the cold air keep him sharp. He did not stop. He needed to move. Stillness had stopped being an option somewhere around. The moment Naomi walked inside and left him standing in an open gate with nothing in his hands. He was back in the city by 3 in the morning. He went to the office, not the apartment, not the estate, which he had not been able to bring himself to sleep in since the night he found the divorce papers on his nightstand, and he sat at his desk in the dark for a while before turning on the lamp and pulling up the files that had accumulated over the past 10 days. His empire had a specific, layered architecture. The legitimate face of it, Kang Holdings, a real estate and development company with a respectable portfolio and a board of directors who were either genuinely uninformed about what sat beneath their feet or informed enough to ask no questions. And beneath that, a structure of arrangements, territories, and agreements that operated on an entirely different system of law. He had built both simultaneously, with the same methodical patience, and for 15 years, the two had coexisted with a functional, if not comfortable, clarity. What was sitting in his files now was evidence that the clarity had been compromised. Han had sent him 3 documents flagged urgent in the past 48 hours. He had read them in the car, at rest stops, the way he read most things that required full attention, without expression, twice. The first was a summary of the territorial agreement reached with the opposing faction, a man named Dae-Soo Park, who ran operations in the northern districts and had been pushing against Jaemin's boundaries for 8 months. The agreement, negotiated in Jaemin's absence by Han and 2 other lieutenants, had resolved the primary conflict and established a formal boundary. Clean, professional, on paper, exactly what Jaemin would have negotiated himself. The second document was a financial summary that did not add up. The third was an internal surveillance report that Han had commissioned 2 days ago from one of their own intelligence operatives, a man named Ryu, who was quiet and thorough and had never once in 7 years brought Jaemin a report that contained anything other than accurate information. Ryu's report contained the name Yuna Seo, and it contained the name Dae-Soo Park, and it contained a transaction record, showing those 2 names connected to the same offshore account. With series of transfers dating back 11 months, Jaemin sat with this document for a long time. He read it 3 times with the kind of focused, dispassionate attention that was not the absence of emotion, but the strict management of it, the way a surgeon might read a scan, extracting information, deferring the human response to later. He set the document down. He picked up the phone and called Han. Han answered on the second ring, which meant he was awake, which meant he had been awake, waiting for this call, which meant Han had already understood what the report implied before he sent it. "Where's Ryu right now?" Jamin said. "At the secondary office. I kept him here." "And the transaction verification?" "Confirmed. 3 separate institutions. The last transfer was 9 days ago, 2 days after we finalized the territorial agreement with Park." Jamin was quiet for 4 seconds. She was talking to Park. For at least 11 months, yes. Han paused, not the pause of someone uncertain, but the pause of someone choosing the right words for information that had a specific weight. "There's more. The Chicago conference last spring, the one where the Lim delegation canceled at the last minute. What about it?" Ryu traced the cancellation. It originated with Yuna. She communicated with Lim's assistant directly and indicated the conference agenda had been modified in ways that made attendance non-essential. "Lim's team assumed the communication came from your office." James said nothing. She had been feeding Park information about our operational boundaries for at least 6 months before the territorial dispute began, Han said. "The dispute wasn't organic, sir. It was engineered." Park knew exactly where to push because she told him exactly where to push. The lamp on Jamin's desk threw a small circle of light across the document in front of him. Outside, the city was doing its 3 a.m. thing, reduced to its skeleton. The surface noise, stripped away, just the low-frequency hum of a place that never fully stopped. "Why?" Jamin said. The question was not naive, he knew why, but he needed to hear it organized. "Our working theory," Han said carefully, "is that she was positioning Park as a power base she could move to if her position in this organization became untenable. She needed the territorial conflict to destabilize you enough that the reconfiguration would look like consolidation rather than a coup, and she needed you distracted." Another pause. "The situation with your wife, we believe she was accelerating that deliberately." Jamin's hand on the desk did not move. "She needed you to lose Naomi," Han said. "Not because of personal feeling. Because a man managing a failing marriage is a man whose attention is split and whose judgment is compromised. She was managing your distraction the way she would manage any other variable." The silence lasted long enough that Han said, "Sir." "I heard you," Jamin said. He ended the call. He sat in the lamp circle for 22 minutes. During those 22 minutes, he allowed himself, in the controlled, private dark of his own office, to feel the full shape of what had just been revealed to him, not the professional dimension, which was significant and would require a systematic and thorough response, but the personal one, the specific sickening clarity of understanding that the event which had cost him his marriage, the hotel, the kiss, the moment Naomi stood in a corridor, holding an anniversary gift, and watched him make the worst choice of his life, had been the product of 11 months of deliberate engineering by a woman who had worked 6 feet from him every day and called herself loyal. He did not break anything. He did not put his fist through the window, or throw the documents across the room, or do any of the things that the rage in his chest was, for a few seconds, genuinely pressuring him to do. He sat still, he breathed. And then he picked up the phone and called Ryu directly and said, in a voice that was completely flat and completely controlled, "I want every transaction, every communication, every contact record going back 18 months. I want it compiled and on my desk by 7 this morning. And I want Park's full operational schedule for the next 30 days. Ryu said, "Yes, sir." And Jamin ended the call, and then he sat back in his chair and closed his eyes and thought about Naomi standing in a pottery courtyard with clay on her hands, laughing, and the thought of it made something in his chest do a specific, terrible thing that he did not have the architecture to process right now, so he sealed it behind the compartment and turned back to the documents. He had an organization to stabilize. He would figure out the rest afterward. The problem with afterward was that afterward had consequences he hadn't fully calculated yet. 7 in the morning arrived with Ryu's file and Han in person, and the three of them spent 4 hours in Jamin's office, going through it with the systematic thoroughness of a post-mortem. The full picture was worse than the summary. Yuna had not simply been feeding Park information, she had been actively misrepresenting Jamin's positions in internal communications, creating document trails that supported strategic misdirections, and in at least 2 verifiable cases had communicated to key associates in Jaemin's network using language that implied his authorization for decisions he had never made. She had been running a parallel operation inside his own organization for nearly a year. The territorial agreement Han had finalized with Park, the one that appeared clean on paper, contained a clause in the third addendum, buried in language sufficiently technical that it had passed 2 reviews without being flagged, that effectively seeded a logistics corridor Jaemin's organization had held for 9 years. The corridor was not in isolation catastrophic. What it was a precedent. The kind of precedent that, once established, became the first data point in an argument for further concessions. Han had not caught it. Han, who was excellent at what he did, and had never given Jaemin reason to doubt his capability, had not caught it because Yuna had drafted the final version of the addendum herself and submitted it for Han's review at 11:45 on a Friday night, timed specifically for when Han's attention was most likely to be at its thinnest. Jaemin looked at Han when this came out of the document review. Han looked back at him with the particular expression of a man who has already had this conversation with himself and has arrived at a position of accountability without needing to be prompted. It was my review, Han said. I missed it. Yes, Jaemin said. Not cruelly, just factually. We fix it. Park won't renegotiate voluntarily. Park will renegotiate, Jaemin said, when he understands the alternative. He closed the document. But that's Tuesday's problem. Right now I want to know where Yuna is. Han was quiet for a moment. That, he said, is the other thing I need to tell you. Jaemin looked at him. She left Bellwether last night. We tracked her vehicle to the airport. She took the 6:50 morning flight to Seoul. Han set a single printed sheet on the desk. She also made a phone call at 11:20 last night from a number we hadn't previously flagged. We traced it. It went to an attorney specifically, a civil attorney who specializes in whistleblower cases and regulatory compliance for financial institutions. The room was very quiet. She's going to talk, Jaemin said. She has leverage too. The information she has if she's been documenting it, and based on her operational methodology, she has constitutes significant exposure for the legitimate side of the business. Kang Holdings, specifically. The development projects in the Harbor District. Han's voice was perfectly level, which was how Jaemin knew the information was serious enough that Han was controlling his delivery very carefully. If she surfaces what she knows to the right regulatory body, the harbor projects get frozen pending investigation. Frozen pending investigation means the financing package that closes in 6 weeks falls apart. The financing package falling apart means, I know what it means. Jaemin stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the city in the early morning light, which was doing nothing particular, just being the city, enormous and indifferent and proceeding. How much does she actually have? Enough to cause significant damage. Not enough to bring the whole structure down, but Han stopped. But she doesn't have to bring it down. She just has to make enough noise that the people who would normally stay quiet start doing the math on whether staying quiet still serves their interests. Jaemin stood at the window for a while. The harbor project was 7 years of work. Not criminal work, genuinely legitimate construction, mixed-use development, the kind of investment that had been the cornerstone of his long-term plan to gradually, systematically, move the weight of his enterprise from the world that operated without law to the world that operated within it. It was the most important project of his professional life, and it was the bridge, the literal financial, structural bridge between what he was and what he had quietly, carefully been planning to become. Yuna knew that. She had been part of the planning. She understood exactly what she was threatening. She knew about the harbor project from the inside, he said. Yes. Then she knows exactly where to apply pressure. Yes. He turned from the window. Who else in the organization has knowledge of the overlap points? The places where the legitimate business and the other operations share infrastructure. But Han considered the question with the care it deserved. 4 people. Myself, Ryu, Park Sung, the financial director, and Yuna. Then we operate on the assumption that Park Sung has also been approached. Jaemin walked back to the desk, quietly. I want to know where he is, who he's been talking to, and I want that information before end of day. Understood. And I want a lawyer on the phone in the next 2 hours. Not our usual counsel, someone outside. Clean hands. He sat down. If she's already talked to someone about a regulatory approach, I want to understand what that exposure actually looks like, legally, before I make any moves that could be characterized as responsive. Han nodded. He gathered the documents from the desk with practiced efficiency. One more thing. Jaemin waited. Ryu flagged something in the bellwether that I should have mentioned first, but held back because I wanted you to have the full organizational picture first. Han set one more sheet on the desk. Yuna made a second call last night before the attorney. At 10:47, Jaemin looked at the sheet. The call log showed a number he didn't recognize. We identified the number, Han said. It's registered to a man named Carter Webb. He's a journalist. Investigative. He's been working on a piece about organized crime's intersection with urban development on the East Coast for approximately 14 months. The air in the office changed. Jaemin looked up from the sheet. She gave him something, he said. We don't know the content of the call, but the duration was 19 minutes, and Webb has been attempting to reach contacts in your organization's periphery for approximately 4 months. He has been consistently carefully deflected. Han paused. A 19-minute call from an inside source changes his access profile significantly. Jaemin set the sheet down. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, with a precision that was somehow more frightening than volume, get me Park Sung's location, a clean attorney, and a full inventory of every document Yuna had authorized access to in the last 18 months. In that order. Go, Han went. The office was quiet again. Jaemin sat at his desk and did not move for several minutes. He was constructing the map, the full, three-dimensional map of the situation, as it actually stood, with all variables present, all consequences extended to their logical endpoints, all assumptions stripped away. This was the thing he was best at, had always been best at, not the violence, not the authority, the thinking. The cold, architectural thinking that could take a complex system under threat and identify the exact sequence of responses that stabilized it with the minimum possible damage. The problem was that the minimum possible damage, in this situation, was not a small number. The Harbor Project could be defended. The legal exposure was real but manageable if handled immediately and correctly, before Webb had time to publish, before the regulatory contact Yuna had made became an active investigation. It required a rapid, transparent, and very expensive restructuring of several of the overlap points, a process that would be uncomfortable and would require Jaemin to have conversations with people he had previously worked very hard to keep at arm's length. It was survivable, but surviving it required something that, until 3 months ago, he had considered a distant, theoretical future plan rather than an immediate operational necessity. He needed to cut the other half of his empire loose, not restructure it, not delegate it, not create another layer of insulation. Actually, genuinely, with all the consequences that entailed, disengage from the criminal infrastructure he had spent 15 years building, because the only way to fully close the regulatory exposure Yuna could create was to remove the thing she was threatening to expose. And the only way to do that in a time frame short enough to matter was to do it immediately, before Webb published, before the regulatory contact became an investigation, before the financing on the Harbor Project had time to get nervous. He would lose certain revenue streams, significant ones. He would also lose the loyalty of a number of associates who had built their operations around the assumption of his continued involvement and would not respond well to his withdrawal. That second category was the dangerous one. Men who felt abandoned by Kang Jae-min had a short historical lifespan, but the 3 or 4 in his structure who would respond to withdrawal with something more than anger and might choose to make that response concrete and physical, those required management. He was constructing the list of those names in his head when his cell phone rang. It was not Han. It was not Ryu. It was not his attorney or his financial director. The number on the screen was one he had personally ensured was known only to 3 people on Earth. It was Naomi's new number. He stared at it for one full ring cycle. Then he answered. Naomi. Her voice came through taut and stripped of the controlled steadiness she had maintained for the entirety of his time in Bellwether. There are 2 men outside Silas's house. He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. What, 2 men? One on the street, one around the back by the workshop entrance. I noticed the one on the street because he's been there for an hour, and it's 9 in the morning, and there's no reason for anyone to stand on this street for an hour. Her voice was low and fast, and trying very hard to sound calmer than she was. Silas says he's never seen them. They're not local. Something cold moved through Jae-min's chest that was not the calculated cold of strategy, but the other kind, the animal kind that his body kept separate from his mind and deployed only when something that mattered was in actual danger. Go inside, he said. Stay away from the windows. Don't call anyone else. I'm already inside. A pause. Who sent them? He was moving across the office toward the door. Not me, silenced Jae-min. Her voice had changed. The controlled fast talk had dropped into something very quiet and very direct. Who sent them? He stopped at the office door. I need 2 minutes to make a call, and then I will call you back and tell you exactly what's happening. 2 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone. Is Silas with you? He's in the kitchen. Keep him in the kitchen. 2 minutes. He ended the call and stood in his office doorway for approximately 3 seconds, running the calculation at full speed, and arrived at the conclusion he had been afraid he was going to arrive at. From the moment Han said Park Sung's name, Yuna had not just fed Park information about Jae-min's organizational boundaries. She had told Park about Naomi, not as a strategic piece as leverage. The kind you activate when you need the other party to be too occupied managing a personal emergency to respond effectively to whatever you're doing on the professional side. Park Sung had not been approached by Yuna as a secondary risk. Park Sung had been working with Yuna from the beginning. He called Han. Find out if Park Sung is in the building. 14 seconds later, Han came back. He's not. He didn't come in this morning. His access card was used at 6:40 to exit the building. He hasn't returned. His personal phone. Off. Jae-min said 3 words that conveyed the full scope of his assessment of the situation, none of which were suitable for formal company. And then he said, very clearly, get someone to Bellwether. Now. Not someone visible. I don't want to escalate what's already there. I want to know who those men work for before anyone makes a move. Ryu goes himself. Tell him no contact with the subjects. Eyes only. Call me with identification before he does anything. How fast? He should already be in the car. He ended that call and immediately called Naomi back. She answered before the first ring completed. The fact that she was holding the phone told him everything about how steady she actually was underneath the controlled voice. There's someone coming, he said. Someone I trust. He's not going to approach the men outside. He's just going to find out who they are. In the meantime, you don't move. Tell me what's happening. Not a demand. Something past a demand, the flat, absolute requirement of a person who has just discovered that the world she spent 6 weeks carefully separating herself from has followed her to the one place she thought it couldn't reach. He told her, not all of it, not the harbor project, not the regulatory exposure, not Webb and the 19-minute phone call. The piece that was relevant to the 2 men standing outside Silas Monroe's house in Bellwether, Yuna's connection to Park, the evidence of coordinated action, the calculation that Naomi had been identified as a point of leverage. While he talked, he was walking toward the elevator, his jacket in one hand and his keys in the other. When he finished, the silence from her end lasted long enough that he said, Naomi, I left, she said. Her voice was very quiet. I left everything connected to your world. I came to a town of 4,000 people and started making pottery. I gave back everything. I signed the papers. She stopped. He could hear her breathing. I know, he said. He pressed the elevator button. I know. Those men outside this house are not my consequence to manage. Her voice had developed an edge that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but something between them that was considerably more volatile than either. Silas is 73 years old. He has nothing to do with any of this. He let me stay in his house because I needed somewhere to go, and he's a kind man. And now there are people outside his house because of a marriage I already ended. I know. He stepped into the elevator. I am going to fix this. You said that about the marriage. The elevator doors closed. He stood in the small steel box, descending 22 floors, and held the phone against his ear, and listened to her breathe, and said nothing, because there was nothing accurate or useful to say in response to that particular sentence, and accuracy had become, somewhere in the last 12 hours, the only currency he had left. The elevator opened to the parking level. He walked to his car. He was pulling out of the garage when Ryu called him back from Bellwether, with the identification. Jamin listened. He listened to the name of the organization the two men outside Silas Monroe's house belonged to. He listened to Ryu, read their descriptions and the plate number of the vehicle they had arrived in, and he listened to the additional detail that Ryu, being thorough, had added: a third man in the vehicle, which was parked around the corner from the main street, engine running. Engine running meant they were not there to observe. Engine running meant they were waiting for a signal. Jamin drove through the parking garage exit and onto the street and pointed the car north and pressed the accelerator in a way that he would not have done if there had been a version of the next several hours in which speed didn't matter. He called Naomi back. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "There are 3 of them, not 2. The third is in a car around the corner. Do not leave the house. Do not open any door or window. Can you lock the interior hallway door, the one between the workshop entrance and the main living area?" Pause. "Lock it. Lock every exterior door. Right now, while I'm on the phone." He heard movement, footsteps, a door, then another. The specific sound of a deadbolt, solid, final. "Done," she said. "Good." He was doing 90 on the highway north, the city thinning out on both sides into the industrial corridor that preceded the open road. Silas has a car in the back, old pickup. He uses it for the kiln supply runs. Keys with him? They're on the hook in the kitchen. Tell him to have them ready. If I tell you to move, you go out the kitchen door to the truck. You both get in. You drive east on the river road, and you do not stop until I tell you where to go. You don't call anyone. You don't stop for anyone who isn't me. Do you understand?" Her voice was absolutely level. "Yes, I'm 3 hours out. Ryu is already there. If anything changes before I arrive, he will call you on this number. And if those men move before you get here?" It was, Jamin thought, the most precise question she could have asked, and the fact that she asked it rather than asking something less specific told him that the Naomi who had been quietly rebuilding herself in a pottery courtyard for 6 weeks was not, under pressure, a woman who needed to be managed or protected from the reality of her situation. She needed to know the truth. "Then Ryu stops them," he said. She was quiet for 3 seconds. "Okay," she said. He drove. Behind him, the city receded. Ahead of him, 300 miles of highway, unrolled in the pale autumn morning light, and somewhere at the end of it, in a town he had visited for 3 days, with nothing in his hands, a woman who had spent 6 weeks building a life without him was sitting in a locked room waiting, because the world he had built had followed her there, and no amount of signed papers, or returned money, or clay-covered hands working toward something real could fully insulate a person from the consequences of who they had loved and what that love had cost them. He pressed the accelerator harder. The city disappeared entirely in his rear-view mirror, and the road ahead was long and straight and gave him nothing to look at but the distance between where he was and where he needed to be. And for the first time in 15 years, Kang Jae-min was driving toward something instead of away from it, and the thing he was driving toward was not his empire or his reputation or his survival. It was a woman in a locked room who had told him she was done with him and meant it, and who was sitting in danger that was his to have prevented and hadn't been, and who deserved, at absolute minimum, to be safe in the life she was building without him, even if she spent the rest of that life. The third man moved at 10:47. Ryu saw it first. The car door opening, the engine still running. The third man stepping out onto the side street with the particular body language of someone who has received a signal and is now executing a timed instruction rather than making an independent decision. He moved without urgency, but also without any of the casual randomness of a person simply going somewhere. He moved like a man on a clock. Ryu called Jamin. Third man is on foot, moving toward the rear of the property. The two on perimeter haven't changed position. Jamin was 2 hours and 11 minutes out. They're running a box. Front, back, and mobile center. Don't let the mobile reach the workshop entrance. Understood. A pause that lasted less than a second. Intercept or deflect? Deflect. Make it look accidental. I don't want anyone alarmed enough to call the other two in. Ryu ended the call and moved. Jamin pressed the accelerator and called Naomi. She answered immediately. She had been holding the phone. He could tell by the speed of it, the half-ring pickup, of someone who has been sitting very still in a locked room, watching the minutes move. One of them is heading toward the back, he said. Someone I trust is going to intercept him before he reaches the workshop door. You're going to hear something outside. Don't move. Don't open the door. Don't look out the window. What's he going to do? Deflect him. That's not an answer. It's the answer I have right now. He checked his mirrors out of habit, clean road behind him. Nothing following. Houseless. A pause. Sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee like it's a Tuesday. It is a Tuesday, Jaemin. Her voice dropped. This man is 73 years old, and he's pretending to be calm for my benefit, and his hands are shaking slightly when he picks up the mug. I need this to be over, I know. How long? 2 hours. She made a sound that was not quite anything, not frustration, not despair. Just the sound of someone absorbing information they don't have the luxury of arguing with. Okay, Naomi. He kept his voice level. If Ryu calls you on this number, you do exactly what he says. No questions, no negotiation. You trust him the way you'd trust me. A silence that had texture to it. I don't trust you, she said quietly. I trust that you're trying to fix something you broke. That's different. He had no answer for that either. He was accumulating a significant number of things he had no answers for, and the list was growing in direct proportion to the distance the car was eating. Up between him and Bellwether. Fair enough, he said. Trust that he's trying to fix something that was broken. She didn't respond, but she didn't hang up. He kept the line open. For the next 7 minutes, he drove and she sat in Silas's locked kitchen, and neither of them spoke, and the open phone line between them carried nothing but road noise and breathing and the particular silence of two people who have said everything and are now just waiting to see what the world does next. Then he heard, faintly through the phone, a sound from her end, something outside. A brief exchange of voices muffled by walls and distance. Something hard making contact with something else. Then quiet. Naomi, still here. Her voice was tight. Something happened outside. I didn't look. Good. His phone buzzed against his ear, incoming call from Ryu. Hold on. He switched. Talk deflected. Ryu's voice was slightly elevated, not alarmed. Just the residual physiological signal of recent physical effort. He's not going to be mobile for a while. I moved him into the alley behind the ceramic supply building. 2 streets over. No witnesses. The other 2 haven't responded. They haven't been signaled yet. How long before whoever sent them expects a check-in? Based on the interval pattern I've been watching, they check in every 30 minutes. Last check-in was 18 minutes ago, which means I have 12 minutes before the pattern breaks and the remaining 2 escalate, approximately. Jaemin did the calculation in the specific rapid way that had kept him functional in crisis situations for 15 years, not optimistically, not pessimistically, but accurately, with all variables present and no wishful thinking allowed. 12 minutes, 2 hours out. The math didn't work in any configuration that ended well if those 2 men escalated before he arrived. I need someone local, he said. Someone who can be there in the next 10 minutes without making the situation worse. Ryu was quiet for 3 seconds. There's a man named Cho in Harfield, 40 minutes south on a normal day, but if he left right now, not fast enough. Jaemin's jaw was tight. What about the third man's vehicle? Still running. Keys in it, I checked when I moved him. Can you reposition it? A beat. Where block the street access to Silas's property from the north. Anything coming in for a hard approach from that direction has to get through it first. That buys 60 seconds, maybe 90. I know what it buys. He was already recalculating. Do it, and then get back on the woman on the front side. The one out front is the decision maker, I can tell by his positioning. If he moves, he calls the shot. I need eyes on him constantly. Copy. He switched back to Naomi. Still there? Still here. Change of plan. Silas's truck, how full is the tank? A brief pause, she was checking. He heard a chair move. Then she came back. Silas says 3/4. When I tell you to move, you go immediately. Not when it feels safe. Immediately. Okay, the River Road East. Take it until you hit the junction at marker 14. There's a gas station there. Closed, but the lot is open. Park in the back of the lot and call me. How will I know when to move? I'm going to tell you. He paused. And Naomi, if you lose the phone, if the call drops, if anything happens that cuts the communication, you move immediately without waiting to hear from me. East on the River Road, marker 14. That's the instruction regardless of what else happens. She was quiet for a moment. You think they might actually. I think I don't know exactly what their instruction set is, he said, with the same flat accuracy he'd been giving her all morning, And I'd rather you be moving on a false alarm than stationary when it isn't one. He heard her breathe. Silas, she said, not into the phone. Slightly away from it, we might need to leave in a hurry. Just be ready. Silas said something Jaemin couldn't hear clearly. Then Naomi came back. He says he was ready when the first one showed up. Tell him he's a practical man. He says he already knows. For 1 second, in the car doing 95 on an empty stretch of highway, with 2 hours of road still ahead of him, Jaemin almost felt something that might, under significantly different circumstances, have been the specific warmth of a moment that reminded you that ordinary people were extraordinary in ways that power and money and carefully constructed authority had a tendency to make you forget. Then Ryu came back on with 4 words. Frontman is moving. The frontman's name, Jaemin would learn later, was Teo, a compact, experienced operative who had worked Park Sung's network for 4 years and had a reputation for clean execution and minimal deviation from instruction. He crossed the street from his position on the opposite sidewalk at 10:59, moving at a pace that was not running, but was not the idle pace of a pedestrian either. He moved like a man covering distance, with a purpose he was not advertising. Ryu tracked him from 40 meters, staying close to the building line, and called Jaemin. He's approaching the front entrance. 40 seconds. Jaemin made the decision in the same moment. Ryu finished the sentence. Naomi, move now. Kitchen truck, east on the river road. Go. He heard her stand up. He heard Silas the scrape of a chair, quick for a 73-year-old man, the quiet authority of someone who has decided that this is the moment and is not going to waste it being indecisive. He heard a door. He heard the specific outdoor acoustic shift of open air and gravel and wind. Then the call dropped. The dead zone on the river road, north of Bellwether, was 3 miles long and had been a documented service gap for years. Jaemin knew this because Ryu had mentioned it in the briefing that morning, and Jaemin had filed it, and now it surfaced with the particular timing of information you wish you had considered more carefully when you had the chance. He gripped the wheel. He called Ryu. She's moving. East on the river road. I need the front man contained. He's at the door. Then contain him at the door. A silence that lasted long enough to have things happening in it. Then Ryu's voice came back, somewhat more textured than it had been. Contained. The second perimeter man. He saw me engage Teo. He's brief interruption of physical sound. He's running north on the main street, toward the vehicle I repositioned. Let him run. He's not the objective. Jaemin was calculating furiously. What's the status of the house? Clear. No entry was made. Ryu's breathing had a slight elevation to it. Now that was the honest physiological cost of doing 2 things at once, while maintaining the kind of operational precision that kept situations from becoming disasters. She got out before he reached the door. Jaemin exhaled once, controlled. Can you verify she's on the river road? Not from... I'd have to move, and I need to maintain position until the second man is fully clear of the area. Stay. Jaemin checked his speed. He was at 98, and the road was straight and empty enough to push further. He pushed. I'll find her at marker 14. He drove. The next 91 minutes were the longest of his professional life, which was a category that included several hours he had spent in genuinely dangerous physical situations, and one specific night 7 years ago in a basement room in Baltimore that he did not discuss and did not think about unless he had no choice. Those 91 minutes were longer than all of it, because in all of those other situations, the person at risk had been himself, had long since been himself, and Jaemin had long with the possibility of his own destruction that amounted to a kind of professional equanimity. You accepted the risk as the cost of operating in the world you'd chosen, and you managed it as intelligently as possible, and when management failed, you dealt with the consequences. He had never fully accounted for what it felt like when the risk belonged to someone else. When the dead zone ended and his phone reconnected to the network, he had 4 missed calls, all from Naomi's number, all from the same 10-minute window when the signal had come back on her end, but not yet on his. He called back without slowing down. She answered on the first ring. I'm at marker 14. Her voice was controlled in the way that voices get when the adrenaline is still fully present, but the body has decided that panic is not currently a useful expenditure of resources. We're in the back of the lot. Silas is fine. I'm fine. There are no other vehicles here, he breathed. Good. What happened at the house? The man at the front door was stopped before he made entry. You were out before he reached you. He paused. You moved fast. You told me to move immediately. A brief silence. I've learned to take that kind of instructions seriously. He understood what she meant. He didn't address it. I'm 30 minutes out. Stay in the truck. Jae-min, her voice shifted. What happens when you get here? What's the actual plan for after 30 minutes from now? It was the question he had been constructing an answer to for the past 91 minutes of highway. He had a partial answer, and he had a direction, and he had the beginning of a decision that, once stated out loud, would be irrevocable. Tell Silas I'm sorry, he said, for bringing this to his house. You can tell him yourself. I know, but tell him now. He paused. And I need you to hear something before I get there. She waited. I'm going to fix this, he said. Not the way I said it before, not meaning I'll manage it, or contain it, or make it quiet. I mean, I'm going to dismantle the part of what I built that made this possible. All of it. The infrastructure, the arrangements, the whole architecture underneath the legitimate business. The reason those men could threaten you today is because I built a world where that kind of threat is a viable tactic, and the only way to make you safe permanently, not just for now, is to make that world stop existing. He kept his voice even. It's going to cost me a significant amount. It's going to make a certain number of people who were previously my allies into people with incentives to oppose me. It's going to take time to do safely. A pause. But it's the only thing I can offer you that isn't just another version of the same failure dressed differently. She was silent for long enough that the road noise filled the space entirely. I'm not asking you to come back, he said. I know you're not coming back. This isn't leverage, or? I know what it is, she said quietly. Another silence. Drive carefully, she said. The road at marker 14 has a bad turn before the lot entrance. He drove carefully. He arrived at 32 minutes, not 30. Because the turn before the lot entrance was in fact badly marked, and he caught it late and had to brake harder than was comfortable. He pulled in to find Silas's old green pickup parked against the back fence of the lot, and he parked next to it and got out, and the autumn air hit him with the particular bite of a morning that had been cold from the start and hadn't warmed up the way it was supposed to. Naomi got out of the passenger side. She looked at him across the roof of the truck. She was still in the green sweater from the diner. Her hair had come partially loose from where she'd had it pulled back, and she hadn't fixed it. She had clay on her right forearm that she hadn't washed off from the morning's exercises, a gray smear from wrist to elbow, already dried and starting to crack at the edges. She looked exhausted and very awake simultaneously, which was what adrenaline did to people who weren't accustomed to it. She looked, and this was the thing he hadn't been prepared for, exactly like herself. Not the composed public version, not the careful, guarded version that had navigated 3 years of his world, but the actual, unedited version, the one that had clay on her arm and loose hair, and had just driven a 73-year-old man's truck out of a bad situation on an instruction relayed through a phone call, and had not fallen apart during any of it. Silas climbed out of the driver's side with the measured deliberateness of a man whose knees were expressing opinions about prolonged sitting. And he looked at Jae-min with the level, assessing gaze of someone who has been told enough to have an opinion and is currently forming it. Mr. Monroe, Jae-min said, I owe you an apology. Silas looked at him for a moment. You owe me more than that, he said, not unkindly. But the apology is a place to start. He looked at Naomi. I'm going to sit in the truck. Tell me when we're going somewhere. He got back in the truck. Jae-min walked around to Naomi's side. She didn't step back. She didn't step toward him either. She stood with her arms crossed, not defensively, just the posture of someone managing a cold that their body is only now starting to register, now that the acute part of the morning is over. Are you hurt? He said. No, he looked at her carefully. She held the look without difficulty. You're sure? I'm sure. She dropped her arms. Ryu called me while you were in the dead zone. He told me what happened at the door. What did he tell you? That the man was there to take me somewhere. Not to hurt me in the house. She said it flatly, with the same quality of voice she might use to report a weather condition, something unpleasant and factual that was worth being accurate about, as leverage.
Yes.
Against you. Against me. She was quiet for a moment. She looked away from him, toward the tree line at the far edge of the lot, bare branches against a white-gray sky. Park sung, He was working with Yuna. Has been for close to a year. And Yuna is in Seoul. Yes, in Park. We're locating him. She brought her gaze back to him. When you say locating him, I mean finding out where he is. He kept his voice precise. What happens after that is going to depend on a number of factors I haven't fully resolved yet. She studied his face for a moment with that same quality of attention she gave to pieces she was trying to read, looking for what was actually there rather than what she expected to see. The thing you said on the phone about dismantling the infrastructure. I meant it. I know you meant it when you said it. She paused. I'm asking if you mean it when you're standing here in a cold parking lot and it's real and not a crisis decision. He held her eyes. Yes, that's going to take years. I know. And before it's done, things like this morning are possible again. Not from this direction. Park and Yuna are specific. They had specific access and specific motivation, and both of those are being addressed. The general exposure is real, and it's why I have to move faster than I originally planned. He paused. But you're right that it's not immediate. She absorbed this. Then I need to go somewhere else, she said. Not because I'm afraid, because Silas shouldn't be in this. And as long as I'm in Bellwether, and anyone who wants leverage over you knows I'm there, Silas is in it. She rubbed the dried clay on her forearm without seeming to notice she was doing it. I was building something real there. I want you to know that. The work I was doing, the pottery, the commission from Silas that wasn't me hiding, that was actually what I wanted. I know, he said. Do you? I saw the photographs Cho sent me. He paused. You were laughing. You looked like someone who had found the right room. He said it without sentimentality, just the plain fact of it. I didn't want to take that from you. I drove to Bellwether, and I didn't have the self-possession, to leave you alone the way I should have. If I had stayed away, Park wouldn't have had a reason to act yet. She was quiet. My being there put the target on Silas's house, he said. That's accurate. She looked at him for a long moment. Are you telling me this so I'll feel better? Or because it's true? Because it's true, he paused. You can feel whatever you want about it. Something shifted slightly in her face, not warmth, not forgiveness, but something adjacent to the recognition of honesty, which was its own complicated thing. I need to go somewhere they don't know about, she said. Somewhere that isn't connected to me, or you, or any of this. I need to be able to keep working, and I need Silas to be able to go home to his house without men standing outside it. She looked at him steadily. Can you make that happen? Yes. Without a security detail following me. He paused for 1 second. Yes, he said. She nodded slowly. Okay. She turned and went to the truck and opened the passenger door and said something to Silas. He couldn't hear it from where he stood, but Silas nodded and started the engine. And then Naomi looked back at Jamin across the lot. I meant what I said before, she told him. I'm not coming back. I need you to actually hear that and not hold it as a temporary position. I hear it. Whatever you're about to do, the dismantling, the restructuring, the legitimate business, do it because it's the right thing to do. Not because you think it might eventually change my mind. He looked at her. And if I told you that those two things aren't completely separate, she held his gaze for a moment, then I'd say that's your problem to work through. Not mine. She got into the truck. Jamin stood in the middle of the closed gas station lot and watched the green pickup pull out onto the river road and head east. And he stood there until the truck was a green dot, and then not visible at all. And then he walked to his car and got in, and sat with his hands on the wheel, not driving. He called Han. Park Sung, he said. We have a location. Han's voice was careful. He's at the Meridian Hotel in the Harbor District. Room 1408. He checked in last night, under his wife's maiden name. His wife's maiden name, Jamin said slowly. Chen, Lily Chen. A pause. He's been there since approximately 8 last night. Room service was ordered twice. His personal cell is still off, but the hotel room phone was used at 7 this morning to call a number we've identified as belonging to a mid-level contact in Park Dae-soo's network. He's reporting in. It appears so. Who knows the location besides you? Ryu. That's all. Jamin looked out through the windshield at the bare lot. I'll be there in 2.5 hours, sir. Han paused. The attorney called. He's reviewed the initial exposure summary from Ryu's documentation. His assessment is that if Yuna's information reaches Webb before we can begin the restructuring documentation process, the Harbor Project timeline accelerates in a way that his words significantly narrows the available response options. How narrow. He said we'd be playing defense instead of offense within 48 hours of publication. Jamin absorbed this. How long to begin the restructuring documentation? He needs you in the room today. I'll be there by 2. He started the engine. Get Park Sung's room number confirmed and keep eyes on the hotel. I don't want him leaving before I get there. And I need someone to make sure Yoona Seo does not get on a return flight from Seoul in the next 72 hours. Talk to our contact at Incheon, make it a customs issue. Something administrative. Something that doesn't look like pressure but achieves the same result. Understood, and Han. He pulled out of the lot. The 2 men from this morning, Tio and the other one. Ryu has them contained. Find out exactly what their instruction was. The full brief. I want to know what Park told them to do, if they got Naomi inside a vehicle, and what the ultimate destination was. Han said he would find out. Jamin ended the call and drove south. The road was empty in both directions and the sky was flat and pale, and the world looked, in the middle of that particular morning, stripped of everything non-essential, just road and sky and bare trees, and the physical fact of a car moving south through all of it, at a speed slightly above legal. He was 40 minutes out from the city when his phone rang, with a number he didn't recognize. He let it ring once, twice, then answered, because unknown numbers in the current situation were either irrelevant or critically important, and he had no way to determine which without picking up. Mr. Kang. The voice was male, mid-40s, educated, the speech pattern of someone who chose words precisely. My name is Carter Webb. I'm a journalist with the Northeastern Investigative Desk. I've been trying to reach someone in your organization for about 4 months. The road ahead was straight and long. Jamin said nothing. I think we should talk before I publish, Webbs said. I have a source. I think you know who. And what she's given me is I want to be fair about this, Mr. Kang. I want to give you the opportunity to respond before anything goes to press. That's the standard I try to work to. Jamin held the phone. When are you publishing? He said. My editor wants it by Friday. 3 days. Where are you? Jamin said. A pause. You want to meet. Where are you? Another pause shorter. The pause of a man who came to make a phone call and is now recalculating whether the conversation has moved in the direction he expected. I'm in the city, South End. There's a coffee place on Meridian Street, across from the Harbor Building. Glass front, green sign. Be there in 1 hour. He ended the call. He drove. 1 hour. He had 1 hour to get back to the city, walk into a hotel on the harbor, have a conversation with Park Seung that resolved the question of what Park Seung was going to do next, and then cross the street to meet a journalist who had 19 minutes of conversation with Yoona Seo and 3 days, until his editor wanted copy. The attorney needed him at 2. Han needed him before that. The Harbor Project needed him yesterday. And somewhere east of Bellwether on a river road, Naomi was in a truck with a 73-year-old man heading toward a location that nobody connected to Park Sung or Yoona or any of this knew about yet. And she was safe for now. And for now was all he could guarantee. And the distance between for now and permanently was exactly the distance between what he had always been and what he was going to have to become in the next 72 hours, whether he was ready or not. He pulled the car back up to 95. The harbor tower came into view at the edge of the city skyline. 20 minutes later, the steel and glass structure that represented 7 years of work and the closest thing he had ever built to a legitimate future. And he looked at it through the windshield and felt, with complete clarity, the specific weight of a man who has arrived at the moment where every decision he makes in the next 3 days will determine not just what he keeps, but what kind of person remains after he's done keeping it. He took the exit toward the harbor. The hotel was 1 block north of the tower. Room 1408 was on the 14th floor. Park Sing's was in it, and Park Sing had spent the last 11 months carefully, methodically, and very nearly successfully dismantling everything Jae-min had built, using the tools Jae-min himself had given him access to. Through a woman Jae-min had trusted, targeting the one person in Jae-min's life who had never asked for any of it and had spent 3 years trying to build something worth keeping inside a world that had made keeping anything genuinely difficult. Jae-min parked the car. He sat for exactly 4 seconds. Then he got out and crossed the street and walked into the Meridian Hotel lobby with the same quality of movement he had always had. In rooms he was about to change unhurried, exact. taking up precisely the space he intended to take up, his face carrying the absolute and communicable certainty of a man who has made his decision and arrived at the location where it gets executed, and whatever happened in room 1408 in the next 20 minutes was going to determine the shape of everything that. The elevator to the 14th floor took 40 seconds. Jae-min counted them, not because he was nervous. Nervousness was a luxury that required available mental bandwidth he was currently allocating elsewhere, but because counting was the thing his mind did automatically in contained spaces when it needed to organize itself before a confrontation. 14 floors, 40 seconds. He used them. Park Sung had been his financial director for 9 years. He had hired the man out of a mid-tier accounting firm on the recommendation of someone he trusted, and in 9 years, Park had been present at the construction of nearly every significant financial structure in the Kang Holdings architecture. He knew where the load-bearing walls were. He knew which columns were decorative and which ones, if removed, would bring the ceiling down. He had been given that knowledge because Jae-min had trusted him with it, and the trust had not been naive. It had been earned over years, tested in several situations that required genuine loyalty to navigate, and never, in 9 years, given him any reason to question it. 11 months ago, something had changed. The elevator opened. He walked down the carpeted corridor to 1408 and knocked twice. Not the tentative knock of a visitor, the knock of someone who is certain the door is going to open. It took 11 seconds. Park Sung opened the door in the clothes. He had clearly slept in a dress shirt, untucked, suit trousers, no jacket. He was 51, compact and precise, of men who have spent their professional lives, making sure numbers added up with the kind of face that had always communicated reliability rather than threat. Right now it communicated something Jae-min cataloged in under 2 seconds as the specific compound of a man who has done something he justified to himself completely and is now standing in front of the person most directly affected by it, and discovering that the justification is holding up less well than it did in the planning stage. Park looked at him. He didn't try to close the door. He stepped back and let Jae-min walk in. The room was a standard business hotel room, clean, anonymous, carrying the particular impersonal quality of a space that has hosted hundreds of temporary lives and retained nothing from any of them. The bed was unmade. Room service trays on the desk. A laptop opened to a document that Park moved to close, then stopped a small, visible calculation, the decision that closing it now would look like exactly what it was. Jae-min looked at the room and then at Park. "Sit down," he said. Park sat in the desk chair. Jae-min remained standing. "I want to hear it from you," Jae-min said, "not Ryu's version, not the document trail. From you." Park looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up. "It wasn't personal. That's where you want to start. I'm starting with the truth." Park's voice was controlled, but not entirely steady, the slight irregularity of a man holding himself together, with the understanding that falling apart in front of this particular person is not a viable option. The organization was changing, had been changing for 2 years. "You've been moving it. I could see the direction, the harbor project, the restructuring plans, the gradual withdrawal from certain operations. I could see where it was going. And the people who stand to lose the most from that transition were looking for someone to tell them when the transition was accelerating." Park paused. "Yuna came to me, not the other way." "When?" 14 months ago. She said she had been building a relationship with Park Dae-soo's network. She said there was an opportunity to position ourselves ahead of the restructuring rather than be casualties of it. He stopped. I knew what it was. I wasn't deceived about what it was. Jae-min looked at him steadily. "You helped engineer a territorial conflict against your own organization. I provided information that allowed Park Dae-soo to identify pressure points. I did not authorize the action against your wife this morning." He said this with more force than anything else he'd said, with the specific urgency of a man making a distinction he needs to be believed about. "I did not know that was the instruction. What I was told was that they were maintaining awareness of her location in case leverage was needed. I did not know Dae-soo had moved to active. You gave Dae-soo her location." Silence. "You told him she was in Bellwether," Jae-min said. Not loudly. Just precisely. Knowing that Dae-soo is a man who uses what he has. Park closed his eyes for a second. Yes, the room was very quiet. Jamin walked to the window. He looked out at the harbor, the water flat and gray in the mid-morning light, the tower visible from here, the structure of what 7 years of disciplined, deliberate work had built, reflected in the glass face of the building across the lot. He stood there for a moment. The addendum in the territorial agreement, he said. The logistics corridor. That was Yuna's specific ask. She needed something concrete to show Dae-Soo that the arrangement was producing results. Did you know what it cost? I knew the number. I'm not talking about the number. Jamin turned from the window. That corridor took 4 years to establish. 3 separate negotiations with 2 different factions and 1 independent operator who didn't want to deal with anyone and had to be convinced over 18 months that the arrangement served him. It took 4 years and you signed it away in a document clause buried in a Friday night review. He paused. Did you know what it cost? Park met his eyes. Yes. Then you understood what you were destroying. I understood what I was trying. To survive. Park's voice shifted. Something underneath it surfaced that was not excuse-making, but something rawer and less organized. You want the honest version? The honest version is that I've watched you spend 2 years slowly turning this organization into something I would eventually have no place in. The legitimate business doesn't need a financial director who knows what I know. The legitimate business needs a CFO with a clean background and a CPA license and no understanding of how the other half of the structure operates. That's who replaces me in the world you're building. He stopped. I was protecting myself. I was wrong about the method. I am not wrong about what I was afraid of. Jamin looked at him for a long time. The honest version, he thought, was that Park was not entirely wrong. The restructuring would have required replacing several people whose knowledge was too embedded in the being removed. He had known this and had not yet worked out how to handle it cleanly. He had told himself it was a future problem and had let it sit in the future rather than addressing it. And Park Sung, who was very good at reading financial trajectories, had looked at the direction of travel and drawn his own conclusions about where he ended up. None of that made what Park had done defensible, but it made it, Jamin thought, human. And he was trying lately to stay honest about the difference. You're going to contact Dae-Soo, Jamin said. You're going to tell him the arrangement is over. You're going to tell him that whatever he's been expecting from this position has changed. And then you're going to prepare a complete documentation of everything you provided to him, every piece of information, every communication, every financial transaction, and you're going to give it to my attorney. Park stared at him. That documentation is a confession, yes. You're asking me to hand you the means to destroy me. I'm asking you to give me what I need to manage the exposure from what you've already done, Jamin said. The distinction matters. If that documentation exists under my attorney's management, it's a controlled disclosure. If Webb publishes and regulators start pulling threads, it becomes something neither of us controls. Park was quiet, and after, he said, what happens to me after? Jamin looked at him with the kind of directness that made the question feel less like a threat and more like a measurement. You resign from Kang Holdings, quietly, with a prepared statement about pursuing other opportunities. You're not prosecuted, not by me, not through anything I initiate. You go, he paused, but you go permanently. No contact with Dae-Soo's network, no contact with Yuna, no contact with anyone connected to this organization. You go and you stay gone, and you build whatever the next version of your life looks like somewhere that isn't here. Park sat with it. That's more than I expected, he said finally. I know. Jamin picked up his chair where he'd set it. Call Dae-Soo now. I need that call made before I walk out of this room. Park made the call. Jamin stood by the window and listened to the conversation and watched the harbor and thought about the logistics corridor and the 4 years it had taken to build and the Friday night it had taken to give away, and filed the specific lesson it contained in the part of his mind that kept the expensive ones for reference. When Park ended the call, Jamin nodded once, told him the attorney's name and number, and walked out. The coffee place on Meridian Street had 6 tables and a counter, and the green sign was faded in a way that suggested either a long and successful history or simple indifference to marketing. And Carter Webb was already there. When Jamin walked in at 12:05, sitting at the corner table with a laptop and a coffee, and the look of a man who had been in enough consequential meetings to have gotten over being nervous about them. He was younger than the voice had suggested, early 40s, with the kind of face that had been trained by years of looking at things that other people looked away from to maintain a certain neutral attention. The journalist cultivated blankness that was not indifference, but the careful management of reaction in service of accuracy. He looked up when Jamin sat down. Neither of them offered a hand. "You came," Webb said. "I said I would. People say a lot of things." He closed the laptop. "I appreciate it." Jamin ordered coffee he didn't particularly want from the counter staff, and then looked at Webb. "What does she have?" Webb was quiet for a moment, the pause of someone deciding how much the other person's willingness to be direct entitles them to direct treatment in return. He apparently decided it entitled him to quite a bit. Financial documentation linking Kang Holdings' harbor project infrastructure to operational accounts that can be traced to non-legitimate activities. Specifically, 2 of the project's subcontractors have payment histories that, with the right forensic accounting, show capital flowing from sources that would not survive regulatory scrutiny. The documentation is accurate. Webb looked at him carefully. "You're not going to deny it. I'm going to ask you what the story is." The story is organized crime's investment in urban development projects using financial structures that obscure the source of capital. And that's not a story. That's a category. Jamin held his coffee. "What's the story?" Webb leaned back slightly. "Powerful man builds empire with dirty money, cleans it through legitimate development, maintains dual identity. That's every third story you've published in the last 10 years. It's a true one. It's a true one about something that is in the process of being dismantled." Jamin set the coffee down. "What you have from Uniseo is documentation of a structure that I am actively deconstructing. Have been planning to deconstruct for 2 years, and have been in the process of doing for the last ends, prior to any awareness that she had spoken to you." Webb studied him. "You're asking me to hold the story. I'm telling you that the story you published Friday is a snapshot of something that exists in a form it won't exist in 6 months from now, and that the more accurate story, the one that is actually new, that your readers haven't read a version of 17 times already, is the story of what it costs to unset something like this from the inside." He paused. "That story doesn't exist yet because it hasn't finished happening. But it will, and when it does, it's more interesting than the version you have." Webb was quiet for a long time. "You're offering me access," he said. "I'm offering you the actual story instead of the preliminary one, in exchange for time, in exchange for accuracy." Jamin held his eyes. "You said you want to be fair. Fair requires the full picture. You don't have the full picture yet." Webb looked at him with the expression of a man running a simultaneous calculation on multiple tracks: journalistic integrity, editorial pressure, the professional instinct that knew when a source was managing him, and the separate professional instinct that knew when what they were offering was genuinely more valuable than the alternative. "How long?" Webb said. 6 months for the initial restructuring documentation to be complete. A year for the full transition. My editor won't hold a year. 6 months for the first installment. Documented progress. On the record." Another long silence. "You understand," Webb said slowly, "that if you're managing me, if 6 months from now the harbor project is fine, and the structure is intact, and nothing has actually changed, I publish everything, including this conversation, I understand. And you're willing to sit here and agree to that. I'm sitting here and agreeing to that." Webb looked at him for another moment. Then he opened his laptop, pulled up a document, and began typing. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Everything about the harbor project structure, on the record, from you." Today Jamin talked for 2 hours. The attorney's office was on the 31st floor of a building 6 blocks from the harbor, and Jamin arrived at 2:15, which was 15 minutes late, which he had never been in a professional context in 15 years, and which his attorney, a quiet, thorough man named Graves, who had the specific demeanor of someone who had seen most of what the law had to offer, and found very little of it surprising, noted without comment. They worked until 7 in the evening. The restructuring plan that Graves laid out was, as Han had suggested, expensive. It required the immediate severance of 12 financial relationships, the renegotiation of 6 contractor arrangements, the voluntary disclosure to 2 regulatory bodies of the subcontractor payment histories. Webb had referenced a disclosure that, structured correctly and initiated proactively before any external investigation began, functioned as cooperation rather than admission, and significantly reduced the legal exposure of the harbor project itself. It required Jamin to personally appear at 2 meetings with regulatory representatives, answer questions with the kind of transparent full transparency that was the professional equivalent of walking into a room with your hands visible. It was survivable. It was not comfortable. It was, Graves said, at the end of the 7 hours, the most aggressive voluntary restructuring timeline he had ever seen a client commit to, and he wanted to make sure the commitment was genuine, because a partial execution would be significantly worse than either full execution or no attempt. It's genuine, Jamin said. Graves looked at him over his reading glasses with the expression of a man who has been told things were genuine by a considerable number of people in his career. What changed? Jamin thought about it. Someone reminded me what I was building it for. Graves apparently found this sufficient, because he went back to the documents. At 7:15, Jamin walked out of the building and stood on the sidewalk in the evening city. For Nixon City, which was doing its 7:15 thing, the particular density of people, heading somewhere after the day, the transition between work and whatever came after it, the city in its most human configuration. He stood in it and felt the full weight of the day settle onto him in a way he'd been managing efficiently for the past 9 hours, and which he now allowed, in the dark and the noise, to simply be present. He called Naomi. She answered after 2 rings. "Are you safe?" he said. "We're at a bed and breakfast in a town called Ellery. Silas knows the owner. She makes ceramics. Apparently everyone in this region knows everyone who makes ceramics." A pause. "We're fine. The owner made us dinner." Silas ate 2 portions and told her the glaze on her decorative pieces showed insufficient understanding of thermal contraction. Another pause. She seemed to find this charming. He heard underneath the report the specific quality of a voice that has been managing itself for a very long day and is reaching the far edge of that management. "How are you?" he said. "Not are you safe again? How are you?" A silence. "Tired," she said, and angry, and relieved, and tired of being one of those things long enough to start the next one. She paused. "How did it go?" he told her. Not all of it, the full picture, could wait until she wasn't in a borrowed room in a town called Ellery after the day she'd had, but the shape of it. Part web. Graves. The timeline. The cost. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, the silence lasted long enough that he thought the call might have dropped. Then she said, "You met with the journalist?" "Yes." "On the record, yes." That she stopped. "That's not a small thing." "No." Another silence. "Are you doing this because of what happened today?" "Because of the men outside Silas's house." The timeline accelerated. "Because of today," he said. The direction was already set. He paused. "But today clarified some things that I had been letting stay theoretical." She was quiet. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Okay, the divorce papers. You need to file them." A long silence. "I know," she said finally, very quietly. "I'll sign them again if you need fresh copies. Whatever the process requires. But you need to file them, Naomi. Not because of me, because of you. You told me in Bellwether that you'd been waiting to be certain you were leaving for the right reasons, and not the right moment." He kept his voice even. "You're certain, you said so. File them." She didn't say anything for a while. The city noise moved around him, a cab, a group of people, someone's music from a window, above all the ordinary evidence of a world that had been proceeding without any knowledge of or interest in the specific, privately devastating day he'd been having. Jamin. Her voice was different now, lower. The controlled management fully down, just the plain tired, actual voice underneath. "I'm sorry about what Una did to your organization. I'm sorry about Park. I know what that cost you." A pause. "And I'm sorry that my leaving gave them the opening they used. I'm not apologizing for leaving. I'm saying I'm sorry that the leaving had consequences I couldn't see." She paused. "That's different." He stood on the sidewalk. "I know it is," he said. "I'm going to file them," she said, "this week, when I get back to wherever I'm going to be." A brief silence. "Is there somewhere safe I can go?" "Not hidden, just. Somewhere that isn't in anyone's calculation right now." He had already thought about this. He had thought about it in the car, driving south from marker 14, while simultaneously thinking about Park and Webb and the attorney. He had thought about it with the specific, involuntary attention of someone who cannot stop solving for a variable, even when the context of the solving has irrevocably changed. I have an apartment, he said. Not connected to my name, it's held through a property trust from 7 years ago, and the trust has no public connection to Kang Holdings or to me. I bought it as a contingency. A pause, it's in Portland. Good neighborhood, quiet building. Studio space in the unit, the previous tenant was a painter and had the second bedroom converted. She was quiet. You're giving me your contingency apartment, she said. You can stay as long as you need to. No rent, no obligation. When you're ready to move on, you move on. He paused. There's no condition attached. It's a space. Use it or don't. Another long silence. A studio space, she said, yes. You remembered that I need a studio space. I've remembered quite a few things, he said. I had a great deal of time on highways today. Something shifted in her silence, not warmth, but the acknowledgement of something. Send me the address, she said finally. He said he would. Get some sleep, she said. You sound like someone who has been running on nothing for 16 hours. 14. Jae-min. Yes, thank you. For today. For coming. A pause. I know I told you that you put the target on the house, and I meant it. But I also know you drove 300 miles, and I know what you did when you got there. And She stopped. I'm not ungrateful. You don't owe me gratitude. I know I don't. I'm offering it anyway. A brief pause. Good night. She ended the call. He stood on the sidewalk for another minute. Then he walked to where he'd parked, got in, and drove to the apartment he'd been using since he couldn't make himself sleep at the estate, and he went in and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the surface of it for a while. Then he got out the divorce papers from the folder. In his briefcase, he had carried them with him since Han had found them on the nightstand, for reasons he had not fully examined until tonight, and he set them on the table, and Simpson signed them again. Carefully, in the places requiring his signature, with a pen that wrote evenly. He put them back in the folder. He would have them delivered to her by courier in the morning, before she had to ask. He sat at the table for a while longer. He was not doing anything in particular. He was not, for the first time in 16 hours, managing something or planning something or calculating the next step. He was just sitting at a kitchen table in an apartment that didn't feel like his, because nothing had felt like his since the night he found signed papers on a nightstand and asked a housekeeper where his wife was. He thought about the pottery courtyard in Bellwether. He thought about the photograph Cho had sent him, the one where she was laughing, the clay on her sleeves, the sunlight. He thought about what it had felt like to sit on that stone bench and watch her work and understand that she had built something real without him, and that the building of it was not a repudiation of what they'd had, but simply the proof that she was still the person he had married, still the woman who moved towards the things she wanted to create, with the same focused, uncompromising attention she had always had, and that he had spent 3 years treating that quality in her as a comfort rather than a fact. Had assumed it would always orient itself toward him rather than toward whatever she was capable of becoming. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong about a number of things. He was working on being less wrong going forward, which was not a comfortable process, and which he was under no illusion would resolve quickly or cleanly or without continued cost. But he was working on it. That was, at this point, the honest version of what he had to offer. 3 months later, the first regulatory disclosure was completed without incident. Graves filed it on a Tuesday morning and called Jae-min at 11 to confirm the receipt and note, with the measured satisfaction of a man who rarely allowed himself measured satisfaction, that the response from the regulatory body had been, as anticipated, cooperative rather than adversarial. The harbor project financing closed 4 days later. The restructured subcontractor arrangements had been accepted. The capital sources had been cleaned through a process that was expensive and uncomfortable and had taken 61 days of continuous work from a team of 6 people, and Jae-min himself, working hours that had no particular shape to them, beyond until it was done. Han called to confirm the closing. His voice carried the specific quality of a man who has spent 3 months watching his employer do something difficult and is choosing not to editorialize about it. The harbor tower breaks ground in 6 weeks. Good, Jae-min said. The Dae-soo situation is stable. Since the arrangement with Park dissolved, his network's expansion has stalled. Our sources indicate he's redirecting resources to the southern corridor. Let him. Han paused. The northern district operations are being transferred. All of them. I told you in October, Han. I know. I wanted to confirm the timeline hadn't changed. It hasn't. Jamin paused. You've been with me a long time. Yes. The transition is going to change your role significantly. A brief silence. I know. If you want to discuss what the new structure looks like for you, I have time Thursday. Han said he would be there Thursday. Jamin ended the call and went back to the document he had been working on, which was a proposal for a community development component of the harbor project, a mixed-income housing element that had not been in the original plan, and which his development team had looked at him with varying degrees of polite confusion when he introduced it, and which he had simply continued to include in every subsequent draft until it became the working plan. He was reading through the housing section when his phone showed a notification from an email address he'd set up specifically to monitor a single source. Webb's publication. He opened it. The piece ran at 4,000 words and was headlined, with the spare directness of investigative journalism that is confident in its material, the cost of getting out, inside one criminal enterprise's attempt to go legitimate. It had his name in the second paragraph. It had the financial details. It had the regulatory disclosure. It had 2 hours of on-the-record conversation from a meeting in a coffee shop on Meridian Street. It also had, in the final section, a paragraph that he read twice. Webb had written, with the careful attribution of a journalist who understood the difference between quoting and characterizing, that when asked what had changed, the subject had said, without apparent calculation, that someone had reminded him what he had been building it for, and that the person who had done that was no longer in his life, and that he considered that, on reflection, a fair exchange. He had not remembered saying that to Webb, but reading it, he recognized it as accurate. He closed the email. He sat at his desk and looked at the harbor tower through the window, steel and glass, the framework of something that was still becoming what it was going to be, the visible evidence of a long and expensive and not yet complete process of transformation. He picked up his phone. He did not call Naomi. He put the phone back down. He had not called her in 3 months. He had sent the courier with the papers the morning after Ellery. She had filed them 11 days later, he knew the date, because the attorney handling his side had confirmed receipt. The divorce was finalized at the end of October, quietly, without ceremony, the legal dissolution of a thing that had already dissolved in a hotel corridor on a night when a man looked at his wife and didn't move. He had been informed of the finalization by email. He had read the email and then gotten up from his desk and walked to the window and stood there for a while. He had not called. The Portland apartment had been accessed, he knew, because he paid the utilities through the trust and had noted the usage patterns change in early November. The consistent presence of someone living there rather than the flat line of an empty space. He knew she was there. He did not know anything else, and he had chosen, deliberately and with some effort, to keep it that way. He had given her the apartment with no condition. Conditions were things you placed on gifts to retain control of them, and control was specifically what he had promised not to exercise. He went back to the housing proposal. 3 years passed the way years pass when you are doing difficult work that does not have a clear endpoint, not fast, not slow, but with a particular texture of time that is fully occupied. That leaves no large empty spaces to collapse into. The harbor tower was completed in the 2nd year. The community housing element came in under budget, which surprised everyone, including Jamin, and was at full occupancy within 6 weeks of opening, which did not surprise him at all. Webb published 2 follow-up pieces. Both were fair. The third, he had told Jamin over coffee, would be the definitive one, the full account, the complete arc, published when the transition was genuinely complete. They met every 3 months. It was, Jamin thought, one of the stranger ongoing relationships of his professional life, and also one of the more honest ones. Ryu stayed on. Han stayed on, in a modified role that reflected the modified organization, and which Han had accepted with the pragmatic adaptability of a man who understood that the alternative was being replaced by someone with a clean background and a CPA license. The Northern District operations were transferred over 18 months, carefully, in a sequence designed to minimize disruption to the people who depended on those operations for income that they would not have found elsewhere quickly. Jamin was not naive about what he was withdrawing from or about the fact that withdrawal did not make it cease to exist, only removed his specific involvement. But it removed his involvement, and that was the thing he could actually do, so he did it. The last of the transitional arrangements was completed on a Thursday in March, documented and confirmed by Graves, who called to inform him, and then said, without editorial, "I believe that's everything." Jamin said he believed it was too. The Seattle Design Exhibition was the kind of event that occupied 3 floors of a converted industrial building near the waterfront, with the particular atmosphere of a serious professional community, celebrating its own work, not flashy, not performative, but the warm, specific energy of people who care deeply about what they make at gathering, to acknowledge that the making matters. Jamin had not come for the exhibition. He had come because a contact in the design world, someone he'd met through the Harbor Project's architectural team, had mentioned, in a casual, professional context, that a ceramics artist named Naomi Bennett was unveiling a major new collection here, and that the collection was drawing significant attention from gallery curators across the Pacific Northwest, and that Bennett Earthworks, which Naomi had founded 18 months ago out of a studio in Portland, had become one of the more talked about names in contemporary ceramics. He had not told anyone he was coming. He arrived without bodyguards of practice. He had gradually, over 3 years, made standard rather than exceptional. He arrived in a coat he'd owned for 4 years, which fit him the same as it always had, and he walked into the exhibition and found the Bennett Earthworks section on the 3rd floor, and stood in front of After the Fire for a long time before he heard her voice across the room. She was talking to a curator, a tall woman, with the confident bearing of someone who spent her professional life persuading institutions to invest in things they weren't certain about yet. Naomi was explaining something about the firing process, using her hands in the way she did when she was talking about the physical reality of what she made, and she was wearing something in a deep rust color that he didn't recognize, and her hair was different from bellwether, shorter, purposeful, the cut of someone who had decided. She looked like a person who had settled into herself, not contentment, exactly more like resolution. The specific quality of someone who has been through the fire they put into their work and come out the other side knowing what they're made of. He did not approach her immediately. He looked at After the Fire for a while longer. The pieces were remarkable in a way that he was not qualified to technically evaluate, but responded to in the way that anyone responds to work, that was made with full honesty, the sense of something real communicated through a form. The fractures were visible in every piece. They had been fired that way, deliberately. The breaks and repairs part of the surface, not concealed, not apologized for, not decorative exactly, but present. The way scars are present on a person who has stopped covering them. He understood what he was looking at. He crossed the room. She saw him from a distance. He saw the moment she did. The brief, involuntary stillness, the same quality of pause he remembered from the pottery courtyard when she'd first noticed him, standing at the gate. Then it passed, and she said something to the curator, who nodded and moved away, and Naomi turned toward him. He stopped a few feet away. She looked at him. He looked at her. 3 years of separate lives between them, the divorce finalized and final, the marriage behind them, with the same complicated permanence as everything that has genuinely happened. "You look well," she said. "You look like someone who knows what she's doing," he said. Something at the corner of her mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. "I'm working on it." They stood in front of After the Fire together. He looked at the collection. She looked at it with him. "Is it about us?" he said. She considered the pieces for a moment. "No," she said. "It's about what came after us." He absorbed that. He told her about the Harbor Project, the housing element, the regulatory process, the web pieces. He kept it brief. She didn't need the full account, just the shape of it, and she listened with the attentive stillness she had always had. The quality that made you feel the listening was genuine rather than performed. When he finished, she said, "I'm glad you did it. I know. Not because of what happened between us. I know that too." He paused. "I did it for that reason, and also for other reasons. I stopped needing it to be only one thing." She looked at him. "That's growth. It's taken a while." "Yes." She looked back at the collection. Bennett Earthworks has a gallery show in April, in New York. It's the first time the work is going east. I'll look for it. You don't have to. I want to. He held her eyes when she looked back at him. I want to know how it goes. Not because I have a claim on it. Because I watched you find it. In a pottery courtyard in Bellwether, covered in clay, laughing at something, an old man said. And I want to know how far it goes. He paused. You can tell me to stop. I'll stop. She was quiet for a moment. How is Silas? He said. Excellent, insufferable. He told my last student that her centering technique showed a fundamental misunderstanding of gravity. She paused. He was right, which made it worse. Tell him I said hello. He'll pretend to not know who you are. That's fair. She looked at the collection again. He looked at her profile, the line of her jaw, the particular way she held her chin when she was thinking, things he had once known so well that he'd stopped seeing them, and now looked at with the specific attention of someone who has lost the right to take them for granted. I should have seen you when you were standing beside me, he said. She turned to look at him. Her expression was not angry, not soft, not forgiving, exactly. It was the expression of someone who has carried something heavy long enough that the carrying itself has become part of them, and who has made their peace with that. But I finally saw myself, she said. He nodded. They stood together for a moment longer, two people who had been through something real, who had cost each other things that could not be returned, who had arrived, separately and at considerable expense, at the specific understandings that some things end, and the ending is not failure, but the final honest accounting of what something actually was. Then another collector approached from Naomi's right, someone who had a question about one of the pieces, and Naomi turned toward him with the professional warmth of someone who is genuinely pleased to discuss her work. Jae-min stepped back. He looked at, after the fire one more time, the fractured vessels with their visible repairs, the broken lines running through forms that had been made stronger by the breaking, the whole collection lit by gallery light that caught every seam and made the damage part of the beauty rather than a counter-argument to it. Then he turned and walked through the exhibition hall toward the exit. At the door he stopped once. Not to look back, he didn't look back. He stopped because the evening air coming through the open door was cold and clean, the way air is on the water in Seattle in the late fall, and he stood in it for a moment and breathed. Behind him, in the warm light of the gallery, Naomi's voice carried explaining something about the firing temperature, about how the fractures happened in the kiln at the highest heat. How? You couldn't predict exactly where they'd break, only that they would, and that the work was in what you did with them afterward. He listened to that for one more second. Then he walked out into the night, and the door closed behind him, and the city was right there, large and ongoing and indifferent and full of everything that still remained to be done. And Kang Jae-min put his hands in his coat pockets and walked toward it. The exhibition lights glowed behind him through the windows. The cracks were visible from the street. They were supposed to be.